Want to go ahead and start sharing your screen?
I think so. We were just told not to share until we were told, but I don't think.
Oh,
this applies to
yeah,
the
yeah,
first.
yeah.
No, but I don't think it applies.
You're the first one, so.
Okay. Let's see. I think it will be impossible to see my graphs, but we'll try.
Okay.
Too tiny. Okay. Is it viewable?
Yeah, I can see it.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, no, come back. How was the weather in Dallas today?
It was gorgeous until yesterday, and it's raining again.
Oh, okay. Well,
I'm going to be indoor watching the conference anyway, so that doesn't make much difference.
right.
So I thought my discussion was probably 10 minutes. So I shortened it a little bit. So if you go over a little bit, that won't be an issue.
I have not been very successful in my rehearsal,
Yeah.
But yeah. Thank you. I'll keep that in mind. Thank you.
Yeah. This is your background, your school?
Yeah, it's a classroom. This is an actual background, by the way. So there's, I don't know if you can see shadow on it. It's just a big canvas with a picture printed. Yeah. This is not a virtual thing. I hate those, so I just did it for the classes that I teach. So I just thought,
nice. Okay.
And so now I feel I have to use it. I'm not sure this is the best decision, but now I've done it, so I should, I might as well use it.
Yeah, it's really nice.
Yeah, so it's a typical classroom. This one does have sea view somewhere here, but that's I think this one.
Oh, that's the
usually that's for executives. Those are the ones who get
of course
a special view. Yeah. So yeah, it's all closed now, right? So we're all confined. So
yeah,
we can't access the building.
But yeah, I like your background. It's hard to find good virtual background that is unique. All the good ones are people.
Fair enough. Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. My problem with virtual backgrounds is that if you raise your hands or whatever, then suddenly
it kind of does the weird. My finger disappear.
So like, okay, let's just do this properly once. Supposed to teach MBA soon again, so let's just make a bit of an effort. Unfortunately, this company didn't inform us that they would send a canvas, but without assemblage. So we had to assemble it. So it was like 2 days of putting this together. So I wouldn't do it again. But it's all good.
Hey, T.I.
Morning, Kelly. How are you?
I put a small packet in your packaged in the mail into your office yesterday, just to let you know.
Yeah, I'll swing by tomorrow actually.
How are you guys holding up? Do you lose power?
I did about 3 days.
Really?
and then boil water.
Really?
Yeah. Don't have any plumbing issues. So that's no water leak. So I'm thankful for that.
Yeah,
But,
that's true. That's true. You guys could all could come to my house. I didn't lose power. I had power, I had water, I had everything. I felt guilty though.
do you have your own generator? How is that possible?
Well, I do have a generator, but I didn't have to use it. I think that we were on the grid that's right by the fire station. We're probably on that same grid,
Oh,
fire
wow.
station. So just a word of advice. I told my realtor, I said, next home we purchase, one of the questions is, what grid are we on? What electrical grid are we on?
Yeah. So should be next to the same grid as hospital or fire station.
But my daughter Mary is at UT Tyler, and they had to transport some of their patients in the level 1 trauma center because they lost power.
Oh, wow.
It's very scary. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna mute myself because it looks like you're about to start momentarily here. Your presenter in just a minute or two. So,
Okay.
and you need to be focused on your people. So,
Thank you.
have a good conference.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. One more thing. If anybody who's listening on this room 2, I kindly ask that you please mute your microphone and allow the presenter just his microphone on, his or her microphone. This is to avoid static in hearing the presenter. Thank you.
But if there's questions, people can unmute themselves and interrupt. Yes?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay,
right.
got it.
Unless you're right. Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Should I introduce you, Pedro?
It's up to you. Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah,
Is it
might as
worth-
well.
Yeah.
It's kind of weird introducing yourself.
Fair
You
enough.
want
Thank
to
you.
start? It's 10 o'clock. So I'll
Yeah,
start.
yeah, sure, please. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. There are people trickling in, but thank you everyone for joining in. The first talk of the conference will be by Pedro Gardete, co-author with his co-author Carlos Santos at Nova School, and they will be talking about recommendation systems beyond matching products to buyers. Please take it away.
Thank you. All right, so thank you all for being here. Thank you so much to the conference organizers, knowing that this is yet another atypical year, and especially in Texas as well. So thank you so much for doing this and keeping it. This is much more important, I think, than sometimes we give it credit for all these conferences. And so thank you for keeping our brains engaged and sort of keeping us sort of active and engaged and sort of pushing ourselves to be thinking about marketing. I also want to thank the selection committee for all the work they do and for considering our paper as well. So thank you so much for that. Okay, so I'm going to start with an example here, and this is from our data set that I'll describe later. This is basically a US car seller that basically sells cars, sort of secondhand cars online. And I'd like to sort of tell here a short tale of 2 vehicles. I'm going to show you 2 vehicles, and this is coming from the data. One attracts on average about 20 page views a day, whereas the other one attracts less than 1. Okay, and so actually the way we sort of pick these vehicles is that the first one attracts the most sort of attention, the most page views per day, and the second one actually attracts the least. Okay. So then we looked at sort of how much time they took to sell. And during the span of 9 months of our data set, the first one, despite all the attention it got, it actually did not sell. Whereas the second one sold in 2 months, which is not the fastest sold sort of vehicle, but of course it's much less than 9 months. And so this is kind of interesting for us, and this is a pattern that sort of sometimes people will discuss whenever I talk about these data, is, well, that there may be some vehicles out there in the data set that may sort of attract a lot of attention, but not necessarily a lot of sales. And so I'm going to show you these vehicles, and I think once I show you sort of the 2 vehicles that popped out once we sort of looked at the page views, you may not be very surprised. So lots of people are looking at the BMW i8, and for some reason, despite all this attention, of course, it did not sell, or at least it did not sell as fast as this Toyota Prius, which sold within 2 months. I believe actually the BMW i8 is the second one most viewed. The most viewed was actually a McLaren, I forget the model, MP4 maybe, I don't know, that took the most attention and again took forever to sell. Okay, and so our starting point for sort of to start thinking about this paper is the fact that different vehicles may behave very differently on these 2 dimensions. On number 1, the attention they generate, and number 2, whether they're likely to sell and how fast they'll sell. And if you go back and think a little bit about the search model literature, for example, this is usually not the starting point. The usual starting point is to think about, well, if I'm searching vehicles, and the reason I'm doing it is to gather information that will decide ultimately whether I want to buy a vehicle or not, you should expect maybe a positive correlation between sort of the attention an alternative gets and sort of how fast it sells. But again, whenever I presented sort of this data set to people and I talked about the sports cars, of course, there's exceptions. And so what I'll tell you and what we'll leverage in this paper is the fact that different types of cars actually don't always line up on these 2 dimensions, okay? And so for us, the question is, well, is that a lever for the seller? Is there something that the seller can do to use this? And so the main contribution of this paper is to investigate whether there is value to sellers in recommending products to consumers beyond sort of the main role of recommendation systems, which is matching products to buyers. Okay, so basically sort of recommending products that I think this consumer will want to buy. And so I want to do a short parenthesis here coming from the literature. It is a myth, actually, that recommendation systems do everything on their own. So you just install the recommendation system on your own systems, on your web page, sort of web server, and then it just works. Well, it functions, but it has well-specified programmed sort of objective functions that they use. And I think this quote by Domovicus and Tuzlin sort of captures the main idea of recommendation systems well. So it says, in its most common formulation, the recommendation problem is reduced to the problem of estimating ratings for the items that have not yet been seen by a user. And once we can estimate the ratings for the yet unrated items, we can recommend to the user the items with the highest estimated rating. And so I would say the main or the first component that goes into a recommendation system is exactly this predictive sort of, you can imagine these are utilities. So the system is trying to predict, how do I maximize the utility of this consumer? Well, here's the highest match value. Let's put up that recommendation first. Okay. Of course, there's many other things that recommendation systems do, and so here we're focusing on one possible or one aspect that we may want to focus on, or people thinking about sellers that are implementing recommendation systems may want to think about. So what we'll find here, basically, we're going to look at the patterns in the data, and these are going to show that inducing clicks, search, basically, may not always mean inducing conversions. And we investigate whether this disconnect can be beneficial for the seller, for a seller that has to recommend alternatives to consumers. So the paper basically takes advantage of a data set that has sort of detailed clickstream data for online used car seller operating in the west coast of the US. The paper is basically 2 parts. The first part is characterizing sort of consumer policies. And so we're going to recover what consumers are doing. We're going to summarize that in terms of search activity and in terms of purchases. And we're going to use machine learning methods to do that. And the reason we're not, for example, using a search model there is because we want to be as agnostic as we can in terms of the particulars of sort of the browsing decisions, especially because I already told you that, well, unless if you have, and we can talk more about that maybe in the end, but unless you have a very, very rich search sort of model, it's unlikely that it will rationalize, for example, the anecdote I showed you at the beginning. And so we want to have a flexible model to capture that. Just like recommendation systems often do, we will also engage in some sort of data reduction. And so we'll sort of put different vehicles into different bins, and I'll tell you more about that. And finally, we're also taking advantage of the fact that our recommendation system relies on almost random sort of variation. So different consumers are going to see different vehicles recommended to them at different rates, but these rates, within those rates, these are sort of randomized recommendations. Once we have the consumer policies recovered as a function of the recommendations, we are going to conduct counterfactual analysis. And what we're going to do here is compare different recommendation policies and try to understand sort of whether there's a role for sort of this search effect on top of sort of the matching effect. So let me also make sure I add this. Please interrupt me at any point. Once I feel I'm losing sort of in terms of time, I'm lost, I'll maybe shut down questions. But in the meantime, if you have questions, please go ahead and just interrupt me. There's no way for me to sort of unmute you or anything, so just go for it. So let me also show you sort of a preview of the results. Basically, we find that in our setting, the recommendation system can induce a matching effect, which is the well-known sort of increasing probability of sale, but it can also introduce an engagement effect. And so the engagement effect that we find takes place mostly after the first product is viewed, at which time we see the most churn. And so what we find is that the recommendation system can do, can do well by sometimes recommending vehicles that don't necessarily sell very well, but are likely to lower that initial customer churn. So the result is a larger base of customers that could have gone and do something else, maybe online, maybe offline, but just decided to stay on the website a little longer and may eventually actually buy. We find that suggesting alternatives with high search rates at the first opportunity can actually increase engagement significantly, or lowering churn. When I say increasing engagement, I mean lowering churn. The seller, of course, benefits through reduced churn, and of course also through increased sort of matches. But there's a way to sort of isolate the engagement effect, and so the benefit for the seller can be also only through reducing churn without affecting the rest of consumer behavior. In our setting, and there's reasons for, I think, for this number being high in our setting. In any case, that's the estimate we're getting. In our setting, the engagement effect accounts for half or a little more than half of the potential value available to the recommendation system, which is, it's certainly first order, at least in our setting. Okay, there are reasons of why probably this will not be as high in some other settings. In the sort of setting of selling durables, this is what we're getting. Okay. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about the setting. The company that shared data with us is called Shift. You can find it at shift.com. They operate in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, and also in LA, San Jose, San Diego, and Portland. They have a unique business model. What they do is maybe good for confinement times. Not that we don't have a share or a stake in the company at all, but in any case, what they do is they offer test drives, and the way they do this is that they'll bring the car to the customer's preferred location. So it could be work or it could be their home. So then the customers drive it around and decide whether they want to buy the car there and then or not. And I think this is still true today. If you sort of browse through shift.com, you'll see that each car is cited, or sometimes at the bottom of the page, with 3 vehicle recommendations. Okay, so other cars you might like. In this case, this consumer was looking at a Toyota Corolla Prius, and she got 3 additional recommendations. Okay. The data consists of all basically web behavior on their website from February until September 2016. We observed about 70,000 users and 450 page views. And there's a lot of variation in these data. Just to give you some sort of couple of statistics here. For example, the number of page views per user is about 7. median is actually 3, but the max is 700 or almost 800. So we actually have a lot of heterogeneity in terms of consumer, behavior here. Conversion rate is 3%. Number of visits per vehicle. During our sample, vehicle was visited 130 times, but one was visited more than 2,000 times. And so we have long tails throughout. We have some customers who just leave right after the first sort of interactions. A lot of customers, go through 2-3 interactions, then a lot fewer later on. And so this is just a histogram of sort of those the number of vehicles that each consumer sees. And so as you can see, a lot of customers see 1 vehicle, and most will stop at 2. And at that point, they may either churn or they may convert. But then you see this really long tail, and this is still truncated because, as we already went through, there's someone who looked at 700 or almost 783 page views, right? So this keeps going. Sort of, there's a very long tail in terms of customer behavior here. Okay, so I'm now going to talk about recovering the customer, sort of the policy function, and then I'll talk about the recommendation sort of investigation. Okay, and so here's the policy function for us. The policy function, just like, for example, in search settings, is going to characterize the probability of a consumer taking a certain action, conditional on a number of characteristics. And so this policy function here is telling us about consumer I at time t. Time for us is going to be the number of vehicles viewed. Okay, so it could be that a consumer, sees 2 vehicles very fast, one right after the other, whereas another one takes time between the 2, even maybe does a new search stint. So there's other research from other fantastic authors about that. That's not what we're covering here now. Okay, and so we'd like to have a likelihood of this search action, and of this action, and this action could be many things. It could be a search action, but it could also just be leaving the website forever, and it could also be converting. Okay, and so we actually have, if you think of sort of J vehicles on the website, we actually have 2 times J plus 1 actions in total. J conversions plus here the outside option plus J search actions. Okay, so there's lots of things that consumers can do. And we want to condition that on basically what are going to be state variables for us. Okay. Now, this seller sells durable goods, which means it's very rare that it finds the same consumer buying sort of products twice. Unlike, for example, Amazon, that will see sort of my purchase history and have a good idea maybe of what I'm interested in. One of the issues for this seller is actually getting customer information. Turns out it's relatively hard for the seller. And so we're going to use the same information this seller has about consumers, which is basically their behavior on the website as they do it. So we're going to be thinking of this analysis in terms of recommending vehicles as a function of X. X is going to be what consumers have been doing, okay, on the website. And so we can target different consumers, for example, depending on the types of cars they're looking at. And again, we want to be flexible about how we estimate equation 1. And so what we're going to do here, is we're going to estimate it through multiple methods. And so we're going to use multinomial logistic regression. We're going to use random forests and also boosting to recover this. And then in the end, we'll pick out whatever sort of technique does the best out of sample. Okay? So that's sort of the general strategy for the customer policy function. But there's a lot still to talk to because we're fitting all these sort of techniques. And so should we be allowed to do this? And so it's worth thinking about it. The first thing I'd like to talk about is the state space that I haven't quite defined yet. And so here are the things that are going to enter the state space for these consumers. We're going to take into account the order of the interaction. So maybe this consumer, we don't want a consumer who's just arrived to the website, behaving the same as a consumer who's been there and looked at 15 cars already. So we want there to at least allow that flexibility in the model. We're going also to take into account the history of the vehicle recommendations. So we also want to take into account that, if the recommendation system has been, for example, recommending always the same type of car, and that's going nowhere, we'd like to incorporate that information as well. And so we'll keep the history of vehicles that have already been recommended for this customer as a state variable. That may be relevant. Number 3, we're going to take sort of customer history into account. And so we're going to basically also include the vehicles browsed up to time t. And in terms of notation, we're going to separate this sort of the state variable into two, and just for notation's sake. I mean, actually, it's not just for notation. It actually has an effect. We're going to have a capital A to consider all the vehicles that I've seen in the past on this website, and we're going to have this lowercase a as the vehicle that I'm looking at right now. So not the past ones, but the present one. Okay. And that is with the expectation that the vehicle that I'm looking at right now, may be in a sense more important than the ones I looked at in the past. So we're going to do that as well. Now,
Pedro,
I told you, yes, please.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, so the T, RT, and the capital A, small a, they're indexed by T. So because you observe these persons over time, but they're also idiosyncratic to the individual, right?
Thank you for asking a question. I'm very happy to hear your voice, Rem. I could not follow the question. What do you mean it's...
Okay. So meaning, so the history of vehicle recommendations is for that particular person, I. You haven't...
Oh, yes. Yes, it could have a T sub I. I'm sorry, yes.
Okay.
So all of these should have a T sub I. I'm just...
That's fine, that's fine. So then, so that is the sum of your heterogeneity, if you want to think of it that way. Otherwise, consumers are homogeneous in every other respect, or is that correct or not?
That is correct. So the nice thing of adding the T is that of course, it interacts with the other variables, right? That's as much as we have in terms of the data, and that's as much as this seller has for the consumers, at least, who did not make a purchase. For the ones who do make a purchase, they do get the data for those consumers. But when they're making recommendations, they don't have any more data. And so that's what we have as well.
That's fine. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's an important question. So thank you. So I told you we're going to estimate this policy through 3 different methods. And that's not really, I mean, that's true, but we do more than that. We also estimate this policy with different types or different numbers of vehicle clusters. And so what we're going to do is, for these 8 levels of possible sort of clustering schemes of cars, we're going to estimate the 3 models. And so we're going to basically be doing a joint selection here of number of clusters with the model that we're going to end up using. So it turns out we're going to end up using 8 vehicle clusters with random forests. It turns out the model really didn't make a big difference. So random forest and boosting did, and multinomial logistic did quite similar as well. Okay, so we make a key assumption here. So now we want to talk a little bit about identification of these causal effects of recommendations and whether we can really do counterfactual analysis with this type of first stage. And so there's a key assumption that we're going to make, which is we're going to assume that consumers do not behave strategically across recommendation policies, okay? So you could imagine that a consumer is looking at Shift one day and suddenly the recommendations seem very different, right? So I'm looking at this Mini again, but now I have all these different recommendations. And so the consumer could even start playing sort of a chess game against the recommendation system. Oh, let me not click this car, otherwise I'll get these other recommendations and I'll skew the recommendation system, etc. I do that on YouTube. So this is realistic. It can happen. So sometimes I'm recommending videos that I really want to watch, but I don't want more recommendations of those. So that happens lately with chess. I was thinking about this as I was preparing the presentation. Sometimes there's a fun chess video. It's quite addictive for me. So I sort of go into incognito mode. I watch that one, but I know that if I go through it the normal route, my future recommendations just get all biased towards chess, okay? And so we think that could happen at Amazon. We think that could happen on YouTube. We don't think it's likely to happen here on a website that most people are looking for one item and don't have a long interaction of and sort of history of purchases there. So we think we're fine. I'll also leave it here. I don't know of any paper that has actually sort of created this game for sort of structural paper that has created a game between consumers and recommendations. It may be realistic in some settings, and so that is, in a sense, still to be done. But that, that's an assumption we're going to make. In terms of the recommendations, so we don't know. We're sourcing from the seller's data, and so we have a data generation process that, in a sense, comes from consumers' actions, but at the same time comes from the recommendations of the seller. And so we don't actually know the full data generation process. Specifically, we don't know the recommendation algorithm of the seller. We know a few things about it that we were able to get, and those were, made us happy. The first one is that the vehicles that are recommended to consumers are done so at chance. Now, not with the same probabilities always, and the probabilities depend on the car that is being seen right now. And that car, we also know which car is being seen right now, so we can control for that. The other way recommendations change is because over time, let me just finish this. If there's a question, I'll just finish this and then wait for a second. The other feature that we have in terms of product rotation is just sales, right? So cars get sold over time, and so they can't be recommended to consumers after a while. And so we also have that source of rotation. Having said this, this is not enough, and so we also talk more about this in the paper, but we still need to ensure a full support condition. What I mean is, we'd like to do the counterfactual analysis as much as we can in sample, and so we would like to make sure that, if suddenly we want to think about a recommendation policy that recommends me a vehicle of type 8 when I was seeing a vehicle of type 1, well, there better be some mass in our data that can help us with that sort of causal effect. And so that's something that we'll check. Now, I heard a very sort of low interference. Maybe there was a question, I'm not sure, but I'll just pause here in case there's a question here. I'll also drink some water. Okay, so I'll show you a little bit of, this is not full evidence, but it's suggestive evidence of the full support condition. What I'm showing you here is for the 8 types of cars that we categorize. This also works with 10. On sort of the rows, you see which vehicle type is the person viewing now, and on the columns, you see what is the probability of a vehicle from each segment showing up. And so we don't have any zeros. We do have lots of situations where you have 4 in 1,000 impressions. You'll see this vehicle show up of this type, but that's enough for us because we have 400,000, right? So we do have mass in sort of all the possible cases. So we're relatively comfortable with this. Okay, so that's as much as I want to add of this first block. And now let me talk about, in a sense, the framework that we use to investigate the recommendation side of things. And so, like in the data, the counterfactual recommendation policies are going to suggest 3 vehicles at a time. And we're going to consider 3 different recommendation policies, at least to start with. And so the first policy we're going to implement is a first best. And so that gives us a theoretical upper bound of what a recommendation system can do. The paper has more details on how this is implemented. There's some state interpolation as well. So of course, recommendation system is a huge sort of a model. And so we're doing all the tricks that we can and sort of verifications as well to make sure that we can sort of use a Bellman equation here, sort of Bellman approach. And so we want to create this first best, which will give us sort of a theoretical upper bound of what you could do with these data. Then we're going to introduce 2 more policies to have sort of as comparisons. And sort of the comparison of these policies will give us some insights. And so the second policy we're going to introduce here is a random policy. So suppose we just give recommendations at random. And this is not the same as not having recommendations. So this is still a recommendation system. It's just a bad recommendation system in the sense that, it could probably do better by, either recommending cars that are most popular or just targeting on the person's behavior. In our case, there are recommendations, but these are going to be drawn at random. Okay, so there's still some value there for sure of offering up recommendations. It's just not very strategic. Finally, and this is really to give us an idea of whether things are working, it's not for any other reason, we're introducing a matching policy. And what this matching policy is going to do is it's just going to recommend vehicles similar to the one that I'm currently viewing. So if I'm looking at a vehicle of type 3, what this policy is doing is just showing me vehicles of type 3, period. Okay. We have to engage in some data reduction as well. And so this is a common feature of recommendation systems. while we want to do this, we also want to maintain interpretability. And so what we're going to do is, as I said before, we're going to use cluster analysis. And so what we're doing is basically aggregating the data up to the cluster level. Okay. And so after we do that, I already said that very briefly before, we are going to compare the auto-sample fit of each model together with the aggregation schemes. And so, as I said before, we're going to opt for random forests and with 8 vehicle clusters in this. We've done a few other cases where we did not find surprises. We haven't done sort of all of the counterfactual analysis with all of these, okay? But we've estimated the consumer policy for all these combinations. This is a sort of a short summary of the clusters that we're going to use. I'm terribly sorry that I couldn't fit cluster number 8 in here. Cluster number 8 is sort of a miscellaneous of the other vehicles. What you'll see here is basically, number of the segment, then representative brands that show up there, distinctive characteristics, so characteristic that is common in a specific cluster, then our own label of how we thought sort of would make sense to think about this cluster, and then the number of vehicles on sale on the website. And so actually, maybe because of the West Coast, maybe because of the San Francisco Bay Area, and maybe LA, the first segment, which is sort of the high-end vehicles, they're actually the second biggest segment in our data set. The second one, number 2, is actually the biggest one, which are sedans and utilitarians. And then you have sort of number 3 is also sort of high-end or mid-high-end vehicles, more often sometimes with manual transmission. So there's a lot of other things happening. We have at some point all-wheel drives, SUVs, number 6 and 7. And, so we just have some heterogeneity of vehicles that the cluster analysis is capturing. Okay, so let me move on and show you the results for the main analysis. And before that, let me also show you a couple of patterns in the data that sort of behave, that are going to be informative for us. So what you see here is a scatter plot of the average number of daily searches on the number of days listed. So each point here is a vehicle in our data. So we have 4,000 vehicles in our data. And so what you see in a sense is what you expect. We see this negative correlation between the amount of attention a vehicle gets, if you will, in the y-axis, and how long it took to sell the vehicle. Or, this is a proxy, but this is the number of days listed on the website. And so this makes sense. This is what we usually expect for most products. Is if a product takes it captures more attention, it probably takes less time to sell. Okay, and so this is fine, but this is not where we started. If you recall with that example, where I in a sense showed you a counterexample, I showed you 2 vehicles that were very different, had exactly the opposite pattern, that they had a different number of daily searches, and then they sold exactly the opposite of what you'd expect. So you didn't see that negative correlation. So then what we did was we clustered these. So we averaged these according to the clusters I just showed you before. Okay, so into these 8 clusters. And so once we do that, you get a very different picture. We just get a cloud of points, to be honest. Of course, these are 8 points. Okay, there's lots of observations that are feeding into these 8 points, though. And so what you see is this is exactly the same axes, but now just by vehicle segment. And so what you see, for example, is vehicles of type 3, for example, topping the amount of attention. If you recall, these were the medium and medium high end vehicles. And number 8, I said, was a miscellanea. There's also a lot of vehicles here that have had an accident in the past, so there may be some bargains there. And so you see some clusters just topping sort of the search rate, but they're not necessarily on this side, okay? At the same time, the very high-end vehicles, they're the ones that take longest to sell, but again, they're not in one of the extremes of the average number of daily searches. And so I'm not sure there's a specific lesson to be taken out of here. I don't see a specific rule. We do have a correlation, a positive trend here, but it could be very close to 0. I think it is significant, but it's a small effect. The main sort of takeaway for us, at least, is that, well, we do have heterogeneity of offerings that do behave differently in terms of purchase rates versus the attention they induce. Okay, and so there may be leeway for the seller to take advantage out of this. Okay, yeah, take advantage of this. Okay, so let me show you now the overall performance of the different policies I told you about before. And I'm sorry, here on my end, I see it full screen. If I recall, on Microsoft Teams, you may see it within the Microsoft Teams window. So I don't know if you can maximize this. I'll be showing a number of graphs. I'll tell you exactly what we're looking at, but in any case, I hope you don't have to squint to see the differences in these lines. Maybe you have, in which case I'm terribly sorry for that. We'll make the paper should be available on the conference website. If not, we'll make it available as fast as possible. Okay, so what we have here is the number of overall conversions, and these are all simulations. So we simulated 1 million consumers here, and we're calculating what happens for the first best policy in blue, what happens for the random policy in orange, and what happens for the matching policy in yellow. Okay. And so the good news is that things behave as one would expect. The first best policy does the best. I think it does 17% better than the random policy. So that's, you know, a significant conversion increase. And throughout, sort of from period 2 onwards, you see sort of conversions always being higher for the first best. Then you see the matching policy, which is not quite random. And so that's nice to see that the matching policy is sort of in between the first best and the random. Now, even though this is a relatively small difference out of 1 million people, I still want to sort of highlight what happens in the first, sort of after the first vehicle is seen. And this is actually one of the graphs that jumpstart the paper. What you see is that it's actually the random policy that does the best in the first period. Okay, and so I just want you to remember that for now, and we'll get into that into more of that in just a couple of slides. Okay, but you know, the first best policy actually does sort of close to the matching policy, and they're both below the random one in the first period. So that's overall conversions. Now let me show you what happens in terms of instantaneous conversion rates. So given that a customer has seen 1 vehicle or 2 or 3 or 4, what is the probability that that customer will buy right now? Okay. And so you'll see that, I mean, if you look at the y-axis, this is a small probability of a purchase in each period. It's less, we're going from 0.1 to 0.9% here. So, I mean, over time, you do get sales over time, of course, but, you know, in each period, the probability of a sale of a customer making a purchase is low. We do see the first best doing better than the matching, that does better than the random. And again, of course, we have that tiny effect right in the beginning of the first period of the random doing a little better than the other two. But that's, I mean, there is a matching effect, so you can match customers to vehicles better over time and sell more, okay? That's at least what, you know, that's one way to interpret these. Finally, the last graph that I wanted to show you that sort of that shows the main sort of simulation exercise is what happens in terms of search rates. And so here, unlike the previous charts where we had in the y-axis, I just went back, you know, something that is between 0 and 1%. Here we have a bigger scale going from 70 to 100%. And we see a large change between the first best policy in blue and the random policy in orange. Okay. And the matching policy is somewhere in between. So what we see actually is that people are a lot more likely to stay on the website if they're faced with the first best policy, okay? 10 percentage points higher, which is, I think, a lot, right? And so the random policy does the worst, and the matching policy does somewhere in between. So this first period is very striking. There are differences in other periods, but because of this scale, you can barely see them, and they're tiny. The main difference in terms of churn or search turns out happens right after the first vehicle is seen. Okay. So this for us is interesting. Going back, we saw differences in conversion rates, instantaneous conversion rates over time for periods that are mostly after the first one, and then in the first one, we have this big difference in terms of customer churn. And so this is how we divided this. We see effects of recommendations starting at the first period. We see that the random recommendation does a little better in the first period. We think the reason for that, it's a small difference, but we think the reason for that is, well, there were some consumers who were going to buy anyway, but some of them saw the first, let's say some of them saw the first best recommendation policy, and they saw something that they liked. And so rather than buy immediately, they bought a little later. They were still going to buy, However, if you're in the random scenario and you got a random recommendation, you're less likely to see something that you like. You were going to buy anyway, and so you anticipated your purchase in a sense, or you didn't postpone your purchase. And so we think that's what's going on in that first period for this small change here in purchase rates for the random, sort of doing better than the others, because then it does worse than the others over time. Now, the first best policy induces 6.2% more search than the matching scenario, which in turn induces 4.5%, excuse me, more search than the random policy. And the full gains from random to first best is 17%. They're explained by two things. Number one, they're explained by higher conversions over time, especially after the first period. And so this is this chart that you'll see the blue line doing better than the orange one throughout, okay? But not in the first period. And then the other reason the first best does better is because it induces lower churn or keeps people on the website, which results in a higher customer base, especially in the first period. And so we call this effect an engagement effect. So it's not that the first best is only increasing sort of the purchase probability at any point in time. It's also keeping more people in the system, okay? And so those people, it's possibly moving them towards buying, you know, maybe I was going to go somewhere else, maybe to a competitor's website. Oh, but I just saw something I like, maybe I'll stick around. Oh, maybe I'll actually convert, okay? So that's our interpretation for these results. Now we want to dig a little deeper into this. And so we'd like to separate these effects. We'd like to try to understand, okay, well, what is the matching effect that happens after the first period? What is this engagement effect that happens right in the first period? And so you can already tell this paper. Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm Salar,
yes,
and I'm timekeeper for this presentation, and we have only like 10 minutes left for presentation.
Thank you. TI donated up to 5 minutes, I should inform you. But please keep doing things as if I did not know of this, and so I'll feel guilty as I start going over time if I do. Thank you so much. Okay, so let's get deeper a little bit into this matching and the engagement effect. And I was going to say, as you can see this paper, we actually had this initial project of decomposing what goes into a recommendation system. And, you know, we introduced a bunch of different things. But then these two were so striking, we just decided to, you know, sort of hone down into this distinction, which I think is sort of a very clear distinction for recommendation systems. So let's tease these two apart. And so the way we're going to do this is the following. We're going to take advantage of the different timings of the effects. We're going to take advantage of the fact that this engagement effect happens mostly in the first impression, after the first impression, and that this matching effect takes place mostly after the first impression. So we're going to use this timing in our favor to decompose these effects. Once you start thinking about it really hard, it becomes, without this, it's not very easy to decompose these effects. So this is a nice way to decompose it for us. So the strategy is, we're going to introduce a new policy. Actually, we're going to introduce two new policies. And these are going to be hybrid policies. They're going to mix the first best and the random policies over time, okay? And so I'm going to show you those now, okay? So here I'm showing you the total conversions again. And I'd like to focus on the blue line, which is the random policy, okay? So we've seen that policy before. And we have two new lines that have not been shown before. One of them is the orange line, the other is the yellow line. The orange line, which is somewhere in the middle of sort of the extremes, sorry, it's somewhere in the middle. What it does is it offers up random recommendations in the first period, followed by the first best policy, okay? So if it does random in the first period, followed by the first best policy, our goal, what we're trying to do is, if we compare it with just the random policy, well, what is the difference? The difference is that after the first impression, the orange does the first best, whereas whereas the blue does always the random. And so what we get by comparing the blue and the orange is the matching effect, basically what happens after the first period. So we're getting the matching effect. So what you see in terms of sales from blue to orange, this effect over here of sales is coming from the fact that, you know, the first best recommendations are always better than random ones over time. And so we can get better recommendations to consumers if we do the first best, okay? And they start exactly at the same point because in the first period, they're both random. So that's how we get the matching effect. How do we get the engagement effect? We get that by comparing the random policy again with the yellow policy. What the yellow policy does is It does the first best in the first period. So remember that reduces churn, keeps engagement in the first period, keeps more people in the system. And then after that, does basically the random afterwards. So everything is the same. We're comparing random against random, except for one of those policies, we do the first best in the first period. Okay, that's the yellow one. And so these are just the full sales. Let me show you. I mean, basically what we're doing in a sense is sort of intensive versus extensive margin, or selling more versus increasing the probability of a purchase versus increasing the customer base. That's what we're really decomposing here. And so let me show you the effects, the results we get. For the matching effect, basically we're turning off the engagement. We're comparing the random recommendation policy with a policy that just does random in the first period. So there's no, engagement effect is mostly reduced to 0 or very close. That alone generates 8.8 higher conversions. So the matching effect for us, doing the first best policy after the first period and doing random in the first one, creates an 8.8% lift. The engagement effect, that means let's compare random against first best in the first period, then random. Okay, so the main thing that's doing is keeping more people in the system. That generates an 11% total conversion increase. So it keeps more people in the system. And I'll add that the purchase probabilities after that remain almost the same. So the first best policy has a very small effect on sort of after the first period of inducing more purchases. It's mostly about that churn. So this 10, or to our surprise, this 11% is higher than this roughly 9%, meaning that this keeping more people in the system actually seems more important in our setting than recommending them necessarily what we think is best for them. Okay? That tweaking or targeting recommendations. And so this, if you sort of add these up, the relative weight of the engagement effect is 55%. Okay? And I'll in a second talk about why we think this should be, is okay for this setting, but in other settings we expect it to be lower. We also, approached this estimate through a different route, and we got, instead of 55, we got 57%. So that seems a relatively reliable estimate. And after the first period, we find virtually no effect on engagement rate. So the first best is still a little better than the other one in terms of keeping people in the system, but by far not at the same rate as in the first period. Okay, so the last thing I'll do is I'd like to know what the first best is doing in that first impression. Okay, what is going on there? And so let me show you, because in the first impression that we know so little about these customers, we can actually look at the recommendations. And so again, here I have in the rows the vehicle that the person is looking at, and in the columns, whether a certain vehicle type is showing up. And so what we noticed immediately is that this cluster number 3 is showing up almost everywhere. And if you recall, cluster number 3 is the one that has the highest search rate, followed by 8 that also shows up. And number 1 barely shows up. That's the very high end. That's the cluster of cars that takes the longest to sell.
I'm sorry again.
Here's a question.
We have 5 minutes. Five more minutes.
Thank you so much. And so for us, it is interesting, right? Number 2 is the one that sells the most. So we're not very surprised with vehicles from cluster number 2 showing up. But for number 3, it's kind of interesting. And so looking at this, we thought about an additional sort of counterfactual analysis to try to understand exactly whether we think, to validate our sort of hypothesis of sort of inducing search, right? And so here's what we're thinking. We're going to pick up the very high sort of luxury cars in the cluster number 1 and number 3 that shows up here in this matrix. And we'd like to know the role of these. And so we'd like to think about whether they are there mostly or just to induce engagement. And so what we're going to do is we're going to remove these, the clusters number 1 and 3, and we're going to replace them with random sort of recommendations of other clusters. So we'd like to see the effect of that. And so that's one way to do it. And if it's really mostly about engagement, that what we should see then is engagement lower, so we should see churn spike up, and we should see very small effect on conversion rates. Okay, if it's really just about the engagement story. So I won't show you sort of the graphs again, but I'll show you the results, and things do behave exactly like we hypothesized. We haven't tested other combinations, so there's more we can do here, but this is the one we did. And so replacing the first period recommendation, the vehicle clusters 1 and 3 in the first period, but just by random recommendations of other vehicle clusters, produced basically no effect on subsequent conversions. Okay, so we go from 5.92 to 6.04%, and that's less than 1 in 10,000 customers in terms of simulation error, where we think there's basically no difference. On the other hand, when we did the same thing, the first period search rate, when we removed cluster number 1 and 3, went down from 96% about from the first best to 87%. And this is big. These are percentage points, right? So this almost matches the first period search rate of the matching policy, so 88, let's say, against 89 or 90. And it approaches almost the random policy. Okay, so it does almost as worse as the random policy. So the role of this segment 1 and 3, at least, also we could have also decomposed them. We have not, but at least this one sort of comparative static, if you will, gives us this result that including clusters 1 and 3 instead of a random set of recommendations of other clusters gives us basically a decrease in engagement with a big effect on sales, but really no effect on sort of subsequent purchases. Okay. So that's where I'll stop. I'll add one more thing, which I think is still worth going through. But just to summarize the paper, so we've identified 2 major value components for sellers recommending products. On top of this matching effect, we found there's a role to create engagement that has not much to do with maximizing necessary purchase probabilities. Okay. Of course, if you can, in a big system, do the whole Bellman equation for a big system, that's fantastic. In a sense, we could do it here. We were lucky in a sense that we could do it here in a setting that has durables, and so there's not a lot of customer data to feed in, and so we can actually manage these number of products and sort of the amount of information we have from consumers, which is not a lot. In a big scale recommendation system of a bigger seller like Amazon, who knows what the effects will be? That's up for future research. So this is relevant in any case for all models, because independently of whether they maximize purchase probabilities, so if you were thinking about calculating or estimating or predicting UIJ, where U is utility, I is the consumer, and J is the alternative, and we're trying to produce all these values, well, maybe you're using a purchase probability, estimated purchase probability. Maybe you're using estimated click-through rate. In effect, you should be doing a combination of the two. Okay, turns out, and you may want to mix in, as our model, as our first best does, you may want to mix in alternatives that are just there to keep people on the website. We also find this effect that seems a little striking, which is this effect seems to manifest itself mostly in the first interaction with the customer. It's interesting, lower search costs mean that consumers can very easily go on to another website of another competitor. And so the first impression seems to matter a lot. I'd be curious to know whether this is sort of constant throughout different settings. And finally, we found in our own setting that this engagement effect may outweigh the matching effect, which for us was surprising. We think that in settings where sellers, non-durable settings where sellers have a lot of information of consumers, they'll be better at the matching part. And so we expect the engagement effect to become less important than the matching effect. In any case, the engagement effect is probably, at least we're trying to document that, at least in our setting, seems important, and so it's likely to stay there. Finally, the last thing I'll say before I finish is that we're also identifying in our setting what we think is a gap in search models, where what we're finding is that consumers are deriving some utility of looking at certain products, not necessarily of thinking of buying them. So consumers don't just search because they want to necessarily buy that car, and so they're trying to get more information to make their final decision. There's also, usually when there's information provision, usually there's also some utility, some consumption utility being provided at the same time. And so I don't think we're there yet, but at least our data patterns seem to suggest that there's some space for search models to start thinking about also the pleasures that consumers get that sort of from hedonic online consumption, the sort of search utility they're deriving as they're browsing through products. I think it's time that we're not doing this yet because it's hard. We may get there at some point, but I think at some point someone has to get into this, I think, big research question that we're not sort of getting too much into, which is that when consumers are looking at alternatives, they're not just thinking mechanistically about the information they're gathering, they're also possibly enjoying the products that they're looking at. Thank you very much for your time, for being here, and I think this is TI's turn, so thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Are we on? All right. Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. So I donated a bit of my time to
That's right.
Pedro, and then I'll try to zoom through my slides as quickly as possible. My name is T.I. I joined UT Dallas this year. Okay, so this project is really relevant and personal to me. I don't know if the organizers knew, but I bought a brand new car 2 months ago. So I will try to meld in my experience into this slide. So I'll briefly summarize the paper, and then I'll give some comments. So the recommendation systems, it has been known that it focused on predicting match values between products and buyers. So it's all about reducing the dimensionality and matching the characteristics. The question is there any benefit of doing anything else? How about customers' hedonic consumptions? What do I mean by that? Have you mindlessly looked at pictures of supercars even though you had no plan to spend $250,000 in a car? I have that experience personally 2 weeks ago. I was looking at Ferraris, Lamborghini. I wasn't going to buy them. I looked at them. If that's the case, then can we measure the value of these kind of user engagement in a recommendation system? And these bottom two cars are the most viewed cars on Pedro's platform, which is McLaren and i8. Not my favorites, but people look at them a lot, and I did look at a lot of Ferraris. Why? So this is the current website. I took this from yesterday. So Pedro's data is from 2016. So it's slightly different, but the idea is you go to the website, and then there's a whole bunch of cars. You click on Honda Accord, which is my wife's car. Then you have this picture of the car, and then there's some price, and there's like a long page. So there's a lot of other information here in the middle about accidents and whatnot. And then there's 3 recommendations. So this website has 3 slots of recommended cars, and that's just fixed in Pedro's setting. So it shows you these different cars. Again, these recommendation engines is not the same as what it used to be. So what you see here, don't make too much inference on what their current, what their old recommendation system was, because this is slightly different. So these consumers, they just come in without much prior information, and they basically click this car, and then the next car they will click, then it will have this page and also 3 recommendations. So the firm seller's problem is, what is the best combination of those recommendations to induce more conversion? Okay, so their state space is they know what car the consumer clicked. So this main picture, this car would be their action, and their previous actions will be state space for next periods. And this website knows what recommendations were made. And there's some, it's a kind of quasi randomization going on here, given the type of car you clicked. And then also the recommendation today will be in the state space for next periods. So the state space is basically history of page views that you saw, and then recommendations that were made in the past, and the sequence. Is this the first car you clicked on, or is it the second and third and so on? Okay. So they use the dimensionality reduction to cluster all the cars into 8 clusters to make it tractable. They use flexible models to characterize consumer search. I'm not going to go into that. I have no time for that. And by the way, I initially thought that this study was going to be about backing up parameters of utilities and seller's recommendation engine and cost, all sorts of things. This paper is slightly different. Okay. And I thought that counterfactuals would be tweaking these parameters that you back out. That was not the case. Rather, what they ended up doing was they used different recommendation scenarios to the consumer model that they recovered, and to see if engagement effects can be measured. Okay, so before going into the counterfactuals, let me just introduce a terminology. So they have first best policy. So this policy assumes that the seller maximizes expected conversion in a Bellman equation in the future periods. And then the baseline, I'm going to call that random RDM. That is the seller's policy showing random recommendations, just random cars at the bottom three. Okay, and they estimated the matching product policy, but we're going to forget about that. So you can simulate these two first best and random policies. Now what they're doing is, it's obvious that first best is better than random recommendations, and the effect is like 17% higher. So that's obvious. And then through these graphs, what they showed was that first best is better than RDM through two mechanisms. One is matching effect. First best is better than random recommendations in terms of conversions, especially in later periods, because they're better at matching cars that the customers want. Also, first best is better than randomization in the first period in terms of churn rate. So first best, a policy customers, after first policy, customers are much more likely to stay on this website. So the churn effect was the biggest in the initial period. So this is basically what they call engagement effects. These two are not completely separable, but the graphs show that these are roughly what's happening. So they go, oh, you know what? We can measure the matching effect to some degree by comparing random all the way. So this bottom line is the baseline. We're going to just show random all the way versus we're going to change the later periods with the first best, but keeping random in the first period. This will measure matching effects because matching effect was the greatest towards the end. How do we measure engagement effect? Again, the baseline is just randomization all the way, but first best in the first period. So using this, they found that matching improves 8.8%. Engagement 11%. So they show that engagement effect is really quite significant. And they show that these engagement effect is driven by these two clusters of high-end cars. They call lookers. So quick comments. This study setting, I think it needs more clarification. There are a lot of features on the website that customers use to do search. Wasn't really shown and discussed, but this model is agnostic about these features. That's fine, but I think more explanation would be fine. I'm going to skip these. One quick thought was, can recommendations change customer perception? Exposure to supercars may expand their consideration sets, making customers more flexible in their choice of cars. It's possible, but then this is high. You need a different data set, but a brief mention would be great. Also, comparison against other search settings. So I enjoy looking at supercars on this website, but do people enjoy looking at restaurant profiles on Yelp.com? I don't think so. Okay, so I think I'm out of time. But basically, the bottom line is, as a platform, don't get more Accords, keep Ferrari and Maserati on your website. People like me like to look at them, and they're useful because those cars can engage customers, keep on searching, therefore help the customer and the firm as well. Thank you.
Thank you. T.I., what car did you buy in the end?
Oh, I had actually a picture at the end. I ended up getting Hyundai Santa Fe, not a supercar.
Fair enough. Thank you. If you could later, if you can show me, send me the presentation, that'd be fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, I will.
Okay. So, hello everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. So, hello everyone. Hope you're all doing well and staying safe. And thanks for attending my talk today. Today, I'm going to present one of my research works with my co-authors, Chuck Weinberg and Ting, which is in the context of privacy concern that the customers perceive in the auto insurance industry and usage-based insurance as an innovation in this industry. Internet of Things, or IoT, is reshaping most of the industries, and it's helping the companies to define the new business models. And according to Gartner, the IoT is likely to grow to more than 20 billion installed units by end of this year, and each of these devices equipped with sensors collecting data. As one example that probably you all know is Fitbit, a wearable device that can collect and monitor many health and fitness metrics like number of steps walked, quality of sleep, and heart rate. And all this information could be used to create insight and value for the company or provide the new business models. As an example of how these collected private data of the customers could change the business models, I want to provide you just one example that John Hancock, a well-known life insurance company, in less than 2 years ago, they announced that they want to turn the life insurance into a wellness game. And right now they are offering a Fitbit device for free to their life insurance customers. And if the customers can hit a certain targets, the company waives the fee for the device. And in addition to that, the customers can get the benefit of, like, for example, 10% discounts for their life insurance premium. Also, automakers are investing in IoT by considering the concept of connected cars. Using many types of sensors in the car enables the automakers and the companies to collect a vast amount of data and monitor the actual driving behavior of the customers, or having the driver's behavior in the car. And all these collected data, the private data of the customers, could be used in the future to generate value. So, but all these values that I provided example exist if the customers at the end accept and agree to share their private data. And considering the privacy concern for the customers is one of the important points in these contexts. And in our paper, we want to focus and discuss these privacy concern in usage-based auto insurance, which is a kind of innovations that auto insurance companies try to measure and monitor the different elements of actual driving behavior, like the mileage driven, hard braking, time of driving, rapid acceleration. And by using all these elements, measuring all these elements in the car, they can set the insurance premium in a more personalized way for the customer to be aligned better with the customer's actual risk of driving. As you can see here, these new program and policy could generate new types of data, but at the same time, new types of privacy concern exist. And in our paper, we try to see a kind of trade-off between the benefits and cost for adopting and using this technology in the customer's minds and from customers' perspective. UBI could be beneficial for drivers and insurers at the same time. As a kind of potential benefit for drivers, it provides an opportunity for the drivers to lower their premium cost by showing safe driving behavior. Means that if the customers show safe driving behavior in a short time period, they can get a significant discount. And also for insurers, it could provide some benefits. It helps the companies to better assess the risk of driving. It can lead to safer driving and fewer accidents. This could be provide benefits for the companies. And to some extent, it may increase the retention rate of the customers, specifically the good drivers, because they can get a good discount in usage-based insurance. They are more likely to stay longer probably with the company. So that could be some potential benefits that exist. But by the nature of this policy that I explained, it seems to be a tension between innovations that rely on using the private data of the customer and the protection of consumer behavior, and in the trade-off that the customers make between the cost and benefits of this policy. We try in our paper to recover the cost parameters that the customers perceive, and after that discuss something about the privacy. Regarding privacy, there are many papers in the literature that they try to study that, and they typically show that people are concerned about the company's access to the private information of the customers in different industries, in healthcare, in online advertising, using the smartphone apps. But typically, most of these studies are survey-based studies. And if you look at the literature of the privacy, you see that there is a gap between the privacy intentions of customers versus actual privacy behavior of the customers, which name as a privacy paradox. And in our paper, we observe the actual privacy behavior of the customers, their actual decision that whether, for example, they adopt to this technology or whether they keep using this innovation. And by looking at the observation and the field observation that we have, we want to capture the cost parameters, including the privacy costs for the customers. Avi Goldfarb and Catherine Tucker, they have a paper that they try to discuss this privacy calculus, that how the customers make a trade-off, specifically in innovative products, between the benefits and cost. And we try to consider these trade-off when we want to model and recover the cost parameters for the customers, as I will show you later. More specifically, in usage-based insurance or UBI, privacy could be a big issue that can limit the widespread adoption of telematics device. But this privacy is not the only concern for the customers. It's not the only cost that they consider. Probably the inconvenience cost of installing the device, the annoying cost of being monitored in the car. So all these things could exist, but privacy could be a major elements in the customer's mind when they want to make a decision to adopt and keep using the UBI policy. UBI in general, we think it's an excellent setting for studying the economic significance of privacy because of different reasons. The first one is UBI is an optional policy. All the insurance companies are offering the traditional form of insurance, auto insurance. And in addition to that, there is an extra option that the customers can adopt and receive, for example, a device and show good driving behavior and get a discount. And one point which is really important here is these two options, I mean the UBI policy and the traditional form, in both cases, the customers get the same kind of service. The auto insurance coverage is the same. The only difference is if the customers adopt to the UBI, and if they show safe driving behavior, they can get an extra discount. So in that way, the customer received the direct economic benefit in UBI, and we can observe that. And it's very crucial if we want to recover and capture the cost parameters in a trade-off. When we observe that direct economic benefits, it makes it easier for us to quantify the cost parameters. The other thing in studying privacy, which is important, is knowing that what information is being monitored. The customers in UBI knows exactly what information is being monitored, because as soon as they adopt to this technology and receiving the device and they plug in the device in the car, they know, the customers know that the company observes and monitors all the driving behavior, the different elements, and these information will be used to set the discount and the premium for their auto insurance policy. And there are other things that could exist here. So considering all these introductions, so we have a couple of research questions here. First of all, we want to see how we can quantify the cost of adopting and using this specific new technology that rely on sharing private data. And following the recovering and quantifying these cost parameters, we want to see if there is any changes in the customer's perception about privacy because of different things, internal or external events that happens, how these changes in the privacy perception can affect the customer responses in UBI program. And I will introduce later the two events, internal privacy policy enhancement that the company announced in the middle of our data, and also an external major data breach events. In terms of methodology, in order to recover the cost parameters and estimate them, we develop a dynamic structural model. We consider forward-looking behavior by customers, and to examine the effect of changes in privacy perception on the UBI usage pattern, we study the effect of, as I mentioned, the internal privacy policy change in UBI, and we use a natural experiment by considering a major data breach that happened in the United States. Our data includes all the customers who submitted the quotation in the period of March 2012 to November 2014 for this specific company. And as you can see in this figure, so in June 2013, a change in the privacy policy, an internal privacy policy enhancement happened for the company. And also in mid-December 2013, a major external data breach event happened that I explain in more details in the next few slides. So in terms of the data, we use a unique data set from a major US insurance company. We have access to a sensor-based individual level data of more than 100,000 customers. And all these customers that we have data are customers that they submitted a quotation to purchase an auto insurance policy from March 2012 and to November 2014. Means that all these customers purchased an insurance policy from this company, and we observed that whether they adopted UBI or the traditional form of insurance, in addition to their demographic information. And if they adopted the UBI, we observed their daily actual driving behavior as well. In terms of the UBI pricing strategy, I just want to provide you a quick overview because probably it can help you to better understand the model that we developed. At the purchase time, as I mentioned, UBI is optional, and the company offers 5% initial discount just to encourage people to adopt. It's just a 5% discount for adopting, for signing up into this policy, and it doesn't depend on the past driving behavior or the demographics of the customer. So this is an incentive for customers to adopt to the UBI policy. And if the customers agree to adopt and use this technology, they receive a telematics device by mail. And they should plug in the device in their car. And after that, the company can monitor the actual driving behavior. Usage-based insurance is not just an optional policy at the purchase time, but even after adopting, at any point, customers can decide to churn, to drop out and switch to the traditional form of insurance. And in our data set, we observe the customer's decision to keep this device, and keep this policy or drop out. So after adoption, we observe that at different time periods, whether the UBI customers stays with this program or they switch to the traditional form of not, and we label them as a kind of dropout customer. Day 75 is an important day in the UBI program, because if the customers stay at least for 75 days, at day 75, the company updates the UBI discount for the customer. And this updated UBI discount is based on the actual driving performance of the customers in the first 75 days. And another thing that exists here, if the customers stays for at least 75 days, the company gives a kind of permanent discount to the customers as well. And permanent discount means that this discount is permanent. Even after returning the device, the customer can get the benefit of these permanent auto insurance discount, which means that as long as they have a kind of auto insurance policy with this company, they can get the benefit of these permanent discounts. So because the day 75 is important, the company updates the discount and they provide a kind of permanent discounts. We consider a 15 days time period after day 75 as a time to observe the dropout rate of the customers in more details. We label them as a kind of informed dropouts. And as I will show later, there is a pattern in the dropout rates of the customers at this time period. But the customers can stay longer in the program, longer than 75 days. And if they stay longer, they can get probably a higher permanent discount. But the maximum time of monitoring in UBI is 6 months, which means that the customers should return the device after 6 months of being monitored, and the company assigns up to 25% permanent discounts based on the actual driving behavior in the whole 6 months. So this is a general kind of overview of the UBI pricing strategy. And in our model, we try to consider the customer's decision in this 6 months time period, their adoption decision and their decision to keep this device or dropouts at different time periods, and model in a dynamic structural way. We have a data summary here. Just want to have a quick overview of that. The UBI acceptance rate in our data set is 30%. Around 30% of all customers who have these options to choose between UBI and a traditional form chose the UBI policy. This adoption is not low, but one thing which is important to note here is the company argues that there is no penalty in UBI, in adopting UBI. It's just extra discount, but just 30% of customers adopt. So it shows that a kind of cost the customers perceive here, and probably one major elements of that could be the privacy costs. If we also look at the average age of the customers for non-UBI and UBI customers, we see that it probably UBI policy is more attractive for younger drivers. It could be intuitive because in a traditional form of insurance, the young drivers should pay typically a very high premium because the lack of driving history, but usage-based insurance provide this chance to them to show safe driving behavior in a short time period and get a significant discount. And the other data summary for the other variables that we have, I want to skip and go to the pattern in the dropout. So I mentioned that the customers can drop out even after adopting to this policy. And this figure shows the percentage of UBI dropouts rates within 6 months of being monitored. We aggregated the data into the biweekly level, 15 days time period. And we see that after adopting at different time periods, what is the dropout rate? We can see that there is a spike in the dropouts at time period 6, which is in a period of 2 weeks right after getting the updated discount at day 75. Around 15% of UBI customers drop out at this time period. So, and in general, it shows a kind of systematic pattern in the dropout in addition to the adoption. And we try to use this systematic pattern and the variation that we observe in the dropout to recover and identify the cost parameters that we consider in our structural model. Right before going to the model, I want to explain a little bit more about the 2 events that I mentioned. So as I mentioned, we in the paper, first of all, we try to quantify the cost parameters, but as I explained, the cost parameters are not just privacy. We try to have 2 events and examine these 2 events that I introduced on changing the cost parameters in our paper. The first event is an internal privacy policy enhancement. The insurance company changed its data monitoring terms for the UBI policy and publicly announced it in June 2013. It was a prominent internal privacy policy, and the company announced that the customer location data would not be stored in the company's server for any future usage. If you look at the news at 2012, 2013, that was the time that many companies tried to adopt the UBI. It was a huge debate that whether the location data and usage-based insurance should be used or should be stored. And before this time period, the company tried to be silent about that. But in June 2013, the company announced that the location data would not be stored in the company's server for any kind of future usage. And the company, this specific company, instructed its agents to inform the current and new potential customer about the new privacy policy in their advertising and in selling to the new customers, or in the CRM communication. They try to transfer this message that these data will not be used in the future. So this is one event that we want to take a look at that in our data set. So in June 2013, this privacy policy announced, and in the model 3 results, we want to see how it could impact the adoption rates of the customers. So we consider different time periods in June and July 2013, which is a period of 2 months after announcing this policy. We see that the adoption rate is above 30%, and in the 2 months, April and May 2013, it's the adoption is average adoption rate of the customers in these 2 months are lower, and the difference that we get between these two time periods are significant. And for the same time period in 2012, we also calculated the adoption rates, and we didn't get any significant differences between the two time periods. I don't provide the reduced form analysis here in my presentation, but we used the diff in diff approach for identifying the effect of this privacy policy enhancement on changing the adoption rate after controlling the time trend and seasonal effects, and we found that this effect is significant. Privacy policy enhancement significantly increased the adoption rates for the customers. We repeated the same analysis for informed dropout rates. To remind you, informed dropout rates were the dropout rates for the UBI customers in the period of 15 days after getting the updated discount at day 75. But for informed dropout rate measure, we didn't get any significant change because of the privacy policy enhancement. The second event that happened was a data breach, an external data breach, a Target department store data breach that reported on mid-December 2013. It was a major and huge data breach. It affected more than 40 million credit cards and people in the United States. And if you look at the news, you can see that it was widely broadcasted in the news. And also, if you check the Google trend of the term keyword data breach or privacy, you can see that it's a big spike on searching these kind of keywords at that short time period. So we know that it's in the completely different industry, Target department store, retail industry, and we are talking in the insurance, but just we wanted to check as a kind of external shock that happened, but it was widely affected people in the United States, how it could impact possibly the customer's behavior in adopting the UBI or using UBI, which means sharing the private data to some extent. So we repeat the same kind of things, the model 3 results. First, I show you the informed dropout rates of customers in different time periods. In a period of 1 month after announcing this data breach. So we see that the informed dropout rate is significantly higher than period 3, which is a period of 1 month before announcing that data breach. And when we look at the same time period in 2012 and having a diff in diff analysis, we see that the data breach significantly increased the informed dropout rates for the UBI customers. But interestingly, we didn't get any significant results for the adoption rates. We didn't find that significantly data breach could reduce, for example, the adoption rate even after controlling the time trend and the seasonal effects that we had. Okay, so I want to go through the model. And is there any question? Or? Okay, so I want to talk about the model that we developed. So as I mentioned, we developed a dynamic structural model to recover and capture the cost of adopting and being monitored in the UBI. And in order to capture the cost parameter, we consider a trade-off between a long-term price benefits in the UBI and two short-term costs that we consider in our model. We consider C0 as the initial cost of adopting to this policy, and C1, which is the per period cost of being monitored. One thing which is, again, important to emphasize, I mentioned before, but I want to remind you again, C0 and C1 are cost parameters. It's not just limited to the privacy cost, but it could include the privacy cost in that, but it may be other costs in C0 and C1. For example, for C0, it could be the inconvenience cost of installing the device. And because of that, first, we want to quantify these cost parameters and then see when we see the changes in the events, whether any changes in C0 and C1 happens or not. So we model the forward-looking behavior of the customers in our dynamic setting, and we consider a finite time horizon, a 5 years finite time horizon for our model. But the point here is we just model the customer's decision in the first 6 months that they can stay in the UBI. We model the adoption of the customers and their decision to keep this device or the dropouts. But the 5 years time horizon that we want to see the long-term benefits, then they can and consider that benefit also as a kind of residual value and valuation in our model. We simply define the utility function and the decision variables that we have at the starting point. It's an adoption decision. So, and after that, it's a decision to keep the UBI or the dropouts. We aggregated our data in 15 days time period. So, and we observed that whether the customers initially adopted, and after that, whether they keep this device or they drop out. For the utility function, we consider a very simple additive model for that. And as you can see, our utility function has two main components. The first component is about the premium that they pay and the discount that they can get. It shows a kind of the benefits that the customers can get from the UBI. And the second component is the cost parameters that customers probably perceive in the UBI. And as you can see, we have two cost parameters, C0, initial cost of adopting to the UBI, and C1, which is the per period cost of being monitored in the UBI. And the discount function, discount is a function of customer's decision and also the state of the customers in UBI. What is their driving performance, and that can impact the discount that they get in the UBI. So we need to define a state variable for our model. So at different stage, we have different variables that we consider, but I highlighted the UBI score. UBI score is the score that the companies gives to the customers, UBI customers at each time period based on their actual driving behavior. Since we aggregated our data at the biweekly level 15 days, UBI score IT is the average UBI score of customer I at time period T. And UBI score in our state space is the only time variant variable that we need to consider transition distributions for these variable. The others are constant between the customers. So for example, the premium, the base premium, the demographic, like gender or age. So, but for UBI score, we need to have a kind of transition. For example, at the first stage, so the customers, before adopting the UBI, they observe their state variables, their demographic and insurance score, which is the score that's about the past behavior. and they need to have an expectation about the UBI score in the first time period. But the point here is, if we want to just rely on the observed variable, observed data to estimate the UBI score in the first period, we have a selection issue here, because we just observed the UBI score for UBI customers by the nature of this program. Non-UBI, there is no way to see the UBI score for non-UBI customers, and because there could be a selection for the customers, it may lead to a bias in estimating the UBI customers for all customers, UBI score for all customers in our transition. So because of that, we to address this issue, we use the Hickman selection correction model. And in order to address this issue, we consider two instrument variables. And the instrument variables that we have are basically based on the agent, the company's agent performance and the number of agents. Because we can assume that, for example, the agent's performance could impact the probability of adopting the UBI for the customers. It can, agents could have this skill to encourage people to adopt to the UBI if they talk to them to negotiate. But this agent's information probably doesn't have that direct impact on the UBI score of the customers in the first time period. So we define two instruments based on that. The number of agents in customers ICT is one of the instrument, and the other is the agent IUBI performance, which means that the customer's eyes agents, because in our data we observe that for each customer, the agent who sold the insurance coverage to the customer, so we can track and see what is the agent's UBI performance. And for the agents who have had a higher performance, higher percentage of sold insurance with UBI, we think that probably they are more experienced in selling UBI, they have more skills, and it can directly affect and be associated with the probability of adopting the customer's eye into the UBI, but probably doesn't have a direct impact on the UBI score of the customer. So considering these two instruments in the first stage, we estimate the probability of adopting and use the estimated probabilities in the second stage in the regression by considering a control function. And in that way, we try to address this selection issue and have a kind of estimated UBI score, not just for UBI customers, but hopefully for all the customers, to have a kind of expectation about their performance before adopting and making a decision about the UBI, because it's critical in our dynamic setting. The customers should have a kind of expectation and form and calculate the valuation for themselves. In addition to the first stage, we also need to have a transition for the UBI scores at the other time period. So it means that the UBI score at what's the probability of getting a UBI, specific UBI score at time t, given the UBI score at time t-1. For this transition, we consider the observed UBI score that we have and a very simple log model that we have, log model, to estimate the UBI score in period t, given the UBI score in period t-1. And given all these transitions and the definition and the model that we have, in a finite time horizon model, we can calculate the valuation functions. The customers in dynamic setting don't maximize their immediate utilities. Instead of that, the valuation function will be used, which means the expected of value the customers get in the future if decides to choose each option at time t. And one thing which is important, as I mentioned before, we model the customer's decision in the 6 months, but residual value is something that we need to consider. We have a 5 years time horizon for in our model. So residual value is the expected, for example, premium or something that the customers should pay after 6 months of being monitored till end of year 5. And because in our data set, in addition to the customers' data in the first year, we observe the actual premium that the customers pays in the second year and the third year renewal. So, and we use that in order to estimate that residual value that the customers get and have a kind of projection for the fourth year and the fifth year as well in our model. As I introduced, we have that baseline model. We can solve and estimate by full solution method. By backward induction, we solve the valuation function for all possible state variables, and we estimate the parameters of our model after controlling the discount factor. So the discount factor that we have here is a biweekly discount factor, so which is equivalent to around 12 to 15% annual discounts that we have. So as I mentioned, we have the 5 years time horizon, and based on that, we have in our baseline model, we have 3 parameters of interest: alpha, price sensitivity of the customers; C0, the initial cost of adapting to the UBI; C1 is the per period cost of being monitored. And we can estimate, and we see that these costs are significant both, but the point again is C0 and C1 are not just privacy costs. They may include the other elements, inconvenience costs, the annoying cost of being monitored in the car, nothing have a trust with the company. All these things could be included in the cost parameters, and we want to see that in the extended model that I will show you in the next slide is how these cost parameters change because of the events that we have in the period of the data. In addition to that, because of the additive model that we have for the utility function, we can simply interpret the cost parameters in dollar value. If we divide the cost parameters by alpha, we can get that, for example, for C0, it's equivalent to $150, and C1 is $16 or $17 per time period that the customers perceive these costs when they want to make trade-off between the benefits, the long-term benefits that they can get from UBI, and the short-term cost that incurred there. So as I mentioned, to capture the changes in C0, we extend our dynamic structural model by allowing the cost parameters to change over time. Instead of having the fixed and constant cost parameters, we consider time variant cost parameters. We try to have to specify a time trend, a polynomial time trend, and in addition to that, we define 2 dummy variables to make it flexible to have a difference in the cost parameters before and after the 2 events: privacy policy enhancement and a data breach. For example, for C0, for the privacy policy, we have a dummy variable, which means that after controlling the time trend on C0, privacy policy can shift the C0 by tau 0. So, and we want to estimate this tau 0, and the same thing for the data breach, and this all for the C0, and for the C1, the same thing exists. We estimate again our structural model in our extended model, and after controlling the time trend effects, we can see interestingly that the privacy policy enhancement significantly reduced the adoption cost for the customers. So adoption cost is significantly lower for the customers after privacy policy, even when we control the time trends in the model. But for the monitoring cost, we don't get any significant change in the adoption costs. On the other way, for the data breach, we found that data breach significantly increased the cost of monitoring, the per period cost of being monitored, but it doesn't have that significant effect on the adoption cost, but it just marginally increased the adoption cost. This is just the results that shows that how the policy enhancement and data breach can impact the cost parameters that we recovered and estimated in our structural form. And it's true that the cost parameters are not just about privacy, but any changes that we get in the cost parameters because of these two events could be linked to the privacy, because these two events are events that could be interpreted as changing the privacy perception of the customers. And if any significant change we get in the parameters, the cost parameters, it could be linked and associated with the privacy. We also check the heterogeneity across the gender groups, female.
Interrupting.
Yeah.
There's only 5 minutes left for the presentation.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you very much. So we also check the heterogeneity across females and males and how they respond differently to the effect of these events on the adoption cost, for example. This figure shows the effect of two events on adoption cost parameters for females and males, and how differently the cost parameters change for these two groups for the two events that we have. For example, for the privacy policy, we see that for females, the green bar, the adoption cost decreased by 4.6, but for males, it was decreased by 8.3 units. So, and this difference is significant, which shows that probably males are more sensitive to in changing the privacy in changing the adoption cost in the privacy policy events. So after privacy policy event, they respond in a more sensitive way than females. Males respond more sensitive. But for the data breach, we didn't get any significant difference between males and females for the changes in their adoption cost. The same thing we did for the monitoring costs. So, and the estimated changes for males and females. For data breach, we found that females increase in the monitoring cost is significantly more than males. So in the opposite to what we found for the adoption cost, for the monitoring cost and for data breach, we find that females are more sensitive to the to this event, to the data breach event, in increasing the cost of monitoring than males. But for the privacy policy, we didn't get any significant results again. We also ran a counterfactual analysis by comparing two scenarios, the current privacy policy enhancement, and also assuming that if no privacy policy change happened, what could be the adoption rates. And in this figure shows the results by comparing the adoption rates with and without a privacy policy change in June 2013. The blue line shows the adoption rate with the new privacy policy on June 2013. Based on the estimated structural model, extended structural model, we can simulate the results for that. And also, the dashed orange one shows that if we don't have any privacy policy change, how the adoption rates could be after that. So, and as you can see, the gap is a kind of significant. It's around 10% increase in the adoption rate after having this current enhancements, privacy policy enhancement compared to the no privacy policy change that we had. As a kind of conclusion, in this paper, we tried to model the forward-looking behavior of customers in UBI to recover and capture the cost of adopting and being monitored in the UBI that can affect the adoption and using the usage-based insurance, which rely on sharing the private data of the customers. We consider two events, one internal privacy policy enhancement, and that we found that it can lower the adoption cost for the customers, and it can increase the adoption rate to the UBI policy, and also in an external data breach event that we found in a short term, it increased the privacy costs for existing customers, the per period cost of being monitored, and it can lead to a decrease in a continuing usage of the UBI. In terms of heterogeneity, we found that females seems to be less sensitive than males to enhance privacy policy. So, and the adoption rate, changing the adoption rate is less than males, but females are more sensitive than males for the data breach in terms of the dropout rates and the per period cost of being monitored. We found that females are more responsive. And in general, it seems that the companies, the data-driven companies, should seriously consider this privacy protection and the privacy strategies. And it, as we have shown, it can significantly impact the adoption and using the personalized new products that they can offer, the products that rely on using the sensor-based data, the private data of the customers, and it can create a huge impact for the companies. So that's it for my presentation, and thank you very much for your attendance, and yeah, thanks.
Hey, thanks. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks. Can you see my slides, Miremad?
Yes.
Oh, thanks. Thanks a lot. So I'm going to discuss this paper. Excellent presentation by Miremad. My name is Max Wei. I'm from USC. I'm going to discuss this paper. So I just first want to say that UBI is kind of popular idea nowadays. I myself has used a UBI called the Metro Mile. I don't know if any of you has used that. It's slightly different from what the Miremad talked about. Here, it's not about your driving habit. It's more about like you pay as you drive. So it's an insurance company. It's not like you don't pay a fixed premium every month. You pay more if you drive more. You could imagine that how much you can save during the pandemic, right? You just the car sits in the garage and you can save a lot of money with this. But I think the paper is touching very important idea that, you know, modern marketing nowadays, we are more and more reliant on consumer data, especially individual level consumer data. And then, you know, eventually we're going to touch the privacy issue. And I think that this is a tension that is under-researched and nicely taken by this paper. Just to summarize what the Miremad has talked about, in this paper, the big high-level review of this paper is that first, it's very nice data from a UBI company, and then they utilize the privacy policy change, which is internal of the company, and then external data breach, which was the target data breach. And then the main tension in the paper, as far as I see, is the trade-off between, you know, privacy. If you choose to participate in UBI, you lose some privacy, but on the other hand, you can get a better price. If you don't participate, then you get a higher price, right? So that's the main tension trade-off. And the main result of the paper, I'm being very, very rough here, is that they found the consumer have a heterogeneous cost of privacy, and they have heterogeneous reaction to policy change and data breach. So this is a very rough, high-level view of the paper. And just to use a few slides to say what I think are the main nice results, the core results of the paper. The first one is very cleanly this result is very clean directly from the data, is that when the privacy policy improved, the adoption of UBI increased. So this is what you can see here in 2013. And you don't find such result in 2012, knowing the dropout rate. So they look at both adoption and dropout. So in terms of the adoption, is people start to use UBI, dropout is for the consumer that are already using the UBI. And then the next very nice and clean result here is that, you know, about the target data breach in 2013, it doesn't affect the adoption rate, but it affects the dropout. Okay, so it's very nice result here again. And on those two things, since it's the core result, I want to give a tiny small complaint or suggestion here is that I think it would be nicer to have a time series plots rather than the bar charts. And there is a very nice time series plot on the adoption rate, but it's in a counterfactual section, and you do see this very clear change, like a regime shift in the adoption rate. And I wonder whether we can have this thing a little bit earlier on in the paper, and whether we can have a similar plot for the dropout rate as well. You know, this might be my personal preference, but it seems to me that when you are talking about the kind of policy change or a very sudden event, time series plots seem to say people kind of want to see time series plots, whether there's a sharp jump or not. The paper does have that, but I want to maybe a little bit earlier in the paper, and also another plot for the dropout rate as well. Okay, And then from the structural model, the paper basically, this is basically from the paper. The paper had from the structural model, the paper is able to separate the cost of adoption and the cost of being monitored, and the results basically align with the reduced form of the model-free results pretty well. So some suggestions, very constructive, hopefully constructive suggestions, not to criticize the paper. I think the paper is in good shape, but maybe the authors can think about them. The first one is the private types of individual consumers. The second one is, I wonder whether it's possible to use more flexible cost specification, especially in the structural model. And I think the paper can also talk more about what's the value added by the structural model. And I have some minor comments. By the way, I have sent these slides to Miremad before, and I have already got some answers, and I'm very happy for that. Okay, my first comment is on private types. This is a difficult question to tackle, to be honest, but I think we want to think about it, right? So the customers know better about their own driving habits than us. By us, we mean both the company and the econometricians. And the paper does, address this to some extent, using the Heckman model. But I think the customers knows better about their own driving habits beyond what demographics can explain. So you can have people from the same zip code, the same gender, income bracket, but they drive in different ways. And if you think about it, this is actually a form of privacy. It's kind of different type of privacy, right? The paper focuses on the privacy in terms of it's intrinsic, it's from the utility function. You don't want people to know where you are. But this type of privacy is more like, I want to hold an informational advantage against the company, so the company doesn't know what kind of type consumer I am, so they cannot price discriminate me. And if you think about it, you can fully model it, and the types can affect UBI score and also consumer adoption, because if I know I'm a bad type, then I'm not going to go and participate, because it's not going to help my premium anyway. And then in the model, you need to integrate it out for estimation, right? Because it's unobserved. Maybe this is too hard, from a dynamic modeling point of view. And maybe you can sidestep it and just say that, okay, can I treat the first period UBI score as the true reflection of the type? But the difference here is that consumer knows this score rather than just predicting it, like what the model is doing now. But I understand this is a very hard problem. Maybe the paper just, the paper is already kind of heavy already in terms of modeling. Maybe they can just argue that this is not very important to model this type of privacy, which I think is acceptable too. But I think this is kind of important issue that the paper might want to discuss a little bit about. The second thing I want to say is the cost specification. So current specification on the privacy cost, especially in the structural model, is that the policy change has a permanent effect and the data breach has a temporary effect. But when I look at the news, this is 2017, and they're still talking about the targeted breach. So whether data breach really has a temporary effect or permanent effect, I think they have the data, right? So they can answer this question. So I wonder whether we can use the more flexible specification rather than imposing those kind of structure. And I think this is important because, not because this is not just a specification issue, which wouldn't be so important for most of the paper, but this paper is talking about cost effects are the main results of the paper. So I think it's kind of important. Maybe we can use monthly fixed effect. Maybe this is too hard because there are too many parameters to estimate. Maybe some robust checks. You can assume data breach has a permanent effect and see whether that model fits better or not. But also this is related to the comments on the bar charts and time series plots I talked about before. It seems more important that we see some more flexible, more evidence that really those two assumptions are correct. And the last thing is more exposure type of thing. Whenever you have structural model, you want to think what kind of things we gain by using a structural model, right? And I feel like when I read the paper, the whole paper is very well written. Don't get me wrong, but I'm trying to find those arguments, but I kind of find the paper kind of lacking in those arguments. And the paper does have a case for structural model. That, for example, the paper can separate the adoption cost and the cost of being monitored using the structural model. And the paper can can use the counterfactual to quantify the effects of policy change. So I think there's a case for the structural model. And along this line, maybe you can think of some other possible counterfactuals, right? You have this very nice model. What kind of counterfactual? One thing I think maybe we can think about the reactive versus proactive policy change. Right now in the data, what happens is, the target data breach happens after the policy change. The company might not be intentionally doing that, but it's a proactive policy change, right? What if the policy change happens after data breach? Are we going to have a different kind of scenario? That's going to be, managerially relevant, because the company can know that if I do reactive instead of proactive policy change, how much money I'm losing, or is there any consequence? So that's going to make the structural model case stronger. But overall, I think the paper has a case for the structural model, and maybe consider explicitly making a case for it in the paper. Okay, then I have some minor comments in terms of, I still have time, so let me talk about them. The paper very nicely, there's a policy change data breach, and the paper very nicely take that into account, in the sense that the customers in the model correctly do not anticipate them in the structural model. And that's very nice. They're very, very thoughtful. But I feel like a little bit more details how this is achieved operationally will help, because this is not the standard way we solve dynamic models. So a little bit more details. And the state space, whether we really need the demographics in the state space or not, and what low dimensionality means in the paper. But those are minor comments, more from of issue of exposition to help readers to understand. And to conclude, I think this is a very, very nice and a promising contribution to the tension between privacy and better customization. Okay, and then broadly, I think, based on this paper, it's very interesting to think about issues like how marketing, which is increasingly reliant on individual data nowadays, right, can progress with the increasing awareness of privacy from consumers. And to what extent do consumers value privacy intrinsically versus for informational advantage? And this paper talks about the privacy, intrinsic privacy, in the sense that you really don't want people to know where you are. You don't want to know people. You don't want people to know. It's in the utility function, but also there's the form of privacy in terms of, you want withhold information so the company cannot price discriminate you. So those type of privacy. So overall, I think it's very interesting to think about this type of question, and I think it's as far as I know, I feel like this is being under researched in the literature. I feel like this paper is a very nice contribution to that. All right, that concludes my discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Max, for your insightful comments.
Thanks.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So can I start? Hi. Can I start?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I will start. So yes. Thank you for coming out. Thank you for giving me this great opportunity to share my research. The title of my research that I'm going to talk about today is the revenue impact of the seat pricing and competition in the movie theater market, which is joint work with my two other colleagues in South Korea, Gihwan and Chung. In this paper, we empirically examine the revenue impact of seat pricing and how it is affected by the competition. Okay, so to give you the motivation of this paper, while most movie theaters implement the several different kind of price destination, such as student discount and the matinee pricing in the form of early morning discount and late night shows. Three forms of almost uniform pricings are widely observed at a given theater. The first form of the uniform pricing is that prices do not vary between weekdays and weekends or across the season. And the second form of the uniform pricing is that one ticket price is charged for all movies regardless of their popularity. So there is no like price hike, even if the movie is very popular with a blockbuster movie. And the third form of the uniform pricing typically observed in a given theater is that all seats are offered at the same price, although most moviegoers have strong preferences for better seats. So no matter where you sit, prices are same at a given theater. Despite the prevalence of this uniform pricing, two empirical studies investigate deviation from the first two forms of uniform pricing. One paper is on the deviation from the first form of uniform pricing, which found that the offering cheap tickets on Tuesday leads to market expansion and increased revenue in the context of the Sydney movie theater market. And the other paper on the deviation from the second form of uniform pricing found that movie-based differential pricing, such as 2D or the 3D movies, yields higher profits than uniform pricing. However, the deviation from the third form, which is all seats are offered at the same price, is not investigated in the literature. That is the issue of how much revenue would be generated by pricing seat quality. So in terms of the literature on performing art, the revenue impact of the seat pricing has received some empirical attention. For example, context of the Broadway show, the price discrimination based on seats for a Broadway show increased the firm's profit by 5% compared to the profit on the uniform pricing. And in the context of the US concert industry, one study found that the revenues are 5% greater when seat pricing is used. However, the limitation of this study is that the context of this study is monopoly in a sense that each Broadway show and concert is unique. So these studies do not consider the relationship between competition and seat pricing. Actually, the seat pricing in a movie theater is a really good example of second-degree price discrimination. As you know, this is quality-based price discrimination. The reason is that this seat pricing is harder to explain observed price differences across seating zones by the cost of providing seat quality. There is like a best body of the empirical literature in IO has examined how market structures affects price, schedule, and menu. But there is little empirical investigation on the impact of the competition on the probability of second-degree price discrimination. Especially in our context that I'm going to talk about today is the multiple market, which enable us to assess the impact of the competition on the return to second-degree price discrimination. So let me talk about the empirical context of our paper. The empirical context of my paper is that the seat pricing in Korean movie theater. So in March 2016, one of the multiplex chain in South Korea named CGV, they classified the seats into prime, standard, and economy zones. And they started charging different price for each seating zone. So as you can see, based on the distance to the screen, seats are classified into economy, standard, and prime, and the prices are different. So the seat pricing schedule is as follows. The ticket for the economy zone is priced 10,000 Korean won, lower than standard ticket price. By the way, 10,000 Korean won is approximately $1 US. And at the same time, the price for the prime zone ticket is 1,000 Korean won higher than standard zone. That's the empirical context of the seat pricing in South Korea. So in this paper, we are trying to address two research questions mainly. The first research question is, what is the return to seat pricing in terms of the revenue and number of moviegoers? And the second question is, how does the return to seat pricing depend on the competition? How the competition affect the impact of the seat pricing? Those are the two main questions we try to address. So let me give you a brief industry background in South Korea movie theater market. South Korea's movie market is the sixth biggest market in the world by gross box office revenue, which is about $1.57 billion in market size. And in terms of the market share, these three theater chains take almost 97% as of 2019. CGV takes almost 50% of the market share, and Lotte Cinema takes almost 30% of the market share, and Megabox takes 20% of the market share. So as I explained earlier, CGV adopts seat pricing in March 2016, but not all CGV theaters adopt the seat pricing. Within CGV theaters, 114 theaters out of 144 theaters, 114 theaters out of 144 theaters use seat pricing. The rest of the CGV theaters do not adopt the seat pricing. And at the same time, there are two, the multiplex chain called Lotte Cinema and Megabox. These two chains charge a single price for all seats, okay? And in terms of the seat pricing, not all shows are subject to seat pricing. CGV theaters use uniform pricing for morning matinee show, okay? So that's brief the background of the Korean movie theater market. So let me talk about data and how we construct the data set. So to construct the data set, we assess each booking website for 444 CGV theaters and 116 Lotte Cinema theaters and 100 Megabox theaters from August 9 to December 26 in 2017. So these 360 theaters represent 99.7% of the total number of theaters of three multiplex chains. So, which is quite comprehensive data that we capture all Korean movie theaters. And throughout the study, we define a show. Show is very important level of data. Show is defined as screening of a movie in a particular auditorium of a theater at a particular date and time. So for example, A Man of Will, which is the title of the movie, played in Cinema 2, which is the specific auditorium of CGV Gangnam. That's name of the theater, on Monday, October 29th, 2017 at 12:20 p.m. So that's the show that we can think of basically, right? So after consumer select the show on the booking website, the booking website presents a seat map. So a seat map is quite similar to what you can see when we book the airplane ticket. So it shows a seat map, then we can choose where we want to sit, right? So same applies to this booking website. So we scrap this seat map so that we can identify which seats are taken and which seats are not taken. And based on that, we can accurately identify how many tickets are sold and how many tickets are not sold, okay? And the website also provide very specific information on ticket prices. So we match these ticket prices with these sales data that we retrieve from the seat map. In our data analysis, we restrict our attention to movies screened more than 1,000 times during the sample period from August 9 to December 26, so that our data set covers 118 movies, and we obtain almost 1.5 million show level data points, which is quite rich data in this kind of literature. Okay, so So let me talk about how we construct the revenue point, which is important variable in our study. So for revenue, if like show is subject to SIP pricing, then revenue is simply the sum of the revenue from each different seat zone. So essentially price for different seat zone times number of tickets sold for different seating zone. And if the show is subjected to the uniform pricing, then revenue is simply the price times number of tickets sold. Okay, so we didn't consider like concession sale. So revenue is just the revenue from the ticket sales. Okay. So in terms of the theater location, theaters are clustered in large cities. So this is the South Korea, and we mapped different theater location on the map. And as you can see, this is the capital city of South Korea, which is Seoul. And 20% of theaters are located in Seoul. Okay. So let me briefly talk about descriptive statistics for 360 theaters and 180 movies, which our data set cover. The first thing to realize is that the theaters differ in size and seating capacity. For example, the theaters vary from the 2 to 19 screens. So the minimum of like 2 screens of a theater and 19 of the screens in a theater. And also they vary from the 30 seats per screen to 273 seats per screen. And on average, there are 2.7 theaters, competitors within 4 kilometers. Okay. And in terms of the theaters using seat pricing, they assign almost like 40% of seats to prime seat, and 35% of the total seats to standard, and 19% of the seats to economy zone. And in terms of the 180 movies, the number of times a movie is shown in our sample period, on average, 12,000 times. Okay, and there are 6.8% of R-rated movies in our sample, and almost 4% the movies is a 3D movie, and 67% of movies are foreign movies. Okay. And in terms of the descriptive statistics of average show attendance, so these like show attendance vary by day of the week and time of the day. So as you can see, Saturday is the most popular day for CGV theaters, and the same apply for like Lotte Cinema and Megabox. They have the 38 tickets are sold for Saturday and Sunday, which is the most popular day. And in terms of the time of the day, so afternoon hours are usually most popular time for the CGV, but for Lotte Cinema and Megabox, the afternoon hour or the evening hours are the most popular time of the day tickets are sold. Okay, in terms of the descriptive statistic for 1.5 million shows, so let me first talk about capacity utilization. So the capacity utilization is defined by ratio of the occupied seats to total seats. So which represent how many like seats are taken out of total seats. So for all shows, the average capacity utilization is 16%. So the 16% of seats are taken, okay, usually. And in terms of revenue, the revenue is almost like $226 US for a show on average. And there are like 12% of shows using seat pricing and the early morning discount. So the shows are subject to early morning discount consist of 18%. Okay, and shows using seat pricing, the capacity utilization is 13%, and then the capacity utilization for shows using uniform pricing is 16%. And the capacity utilization for shows using seat pricing differ across the different seating zones. For example, prime zone is the most popular because their capacity utilization is higher, which is 8%, and the standard zone is 4%. But economy zone has significantly lower capacity utilization compared to other seating zone. Okay. All right. So let me talk about competition measure, which is important variable in our analysis because we are analyzing the revenue effect of second-degree price designation and how the revenue effect differs across like different competition. So usually the previous studies operationalize the competition between theaters, which is measured by the number of live theaters within a given distance. However, one problem with this approach is that these measures might not be appropriate because when there is not enough variation in the entry or the exit of the theaters, then these competition measures are not good enough. And also when we use like fixed effects to control for time invariant theater characteristics, then this competition measure is also not appropriate. And also in our study, this competition measure is not good enough because the unit of analysis is show so that like there is not many variation in terms of the competition measure because for a show which is played in the same movie theater, they will share the same like a competition measure. So because of this, we construct a new competition measure. And according to the survey by the Korean Movie Association, theater location and show times are most important factors that moviegoers consider when they are planning to watch a particular movie. So which means that the theater location and show times are important variable that can affect the demand and then the competition. So we take into account a number of nearby theaters and show time intervals when you construct the competition measure. So for show I, so competition measure is defined as show I. We calculate the competition measure as the number of shows of the same movie played by theaters within a certain radius from a theater playing show I and within the show time window, 8 hours, before and after the show starts. So essentially, this captures how many movies are played by the rival theaters within a certain distance and a certain time window. So that's our competition measure. So let me briefly talk about like descriptive statistics of competition measure. So in our study, we focus on radius of 2 and 4 kilometer. As far as I know, 4 kilometer is about 2.5 miles. Okay, and in the short time intervals of 1 hour and 3 hours. So there are like on average 11.7 movies. 7 of the same movies are played by other theaters located within like 4 kilometers. And the time interval before and after 3 hours. Okay. So let me talk about estimation strategy to answer our research question. So our research question is the revenue impact of the seat pricing. So to estimate this revenue impact, we use the reduced form equation. On the dependent variable, we have like low revenue. And the independent variable, we have a bunch of fixed effects and the observable that can affect the revenue and at the same time seat pricing. So revenue is as R represent revenue for show I, and XI is vector of the show specific characteristics that can affect the revenue and also the seat pricing. Such as capacity, premium auditorium, and 3D movie, and early morning, opening week, and these variables. And YI is a vector of the competition measure and dummies for range of the capacity utilization. So later, we'll check whether there is a revenue impact across different range of the capacity utilization, which I'll talk about shortly. And SP is an indicator variable that is equal to 1 if show I use the seat pricing and 0 otherwise. And also Z is a vector of the time-varying market characteristics, which is like foot traffic that I'll talk about in the next slide, and daily weather that can affect demand. And we also include a bunch of fixed effects to control the unobserved factors that can affect the SIP pricing and at the same time revenue. And then the beta 3 is our main interest, which can capture the effect of the SIP pricing. So we also control like the market and movie characteristics. In terms of the market characteristics, non-time varying demand factors are controlled by theater fixed effects that we include this theater fixed effect in our regression equation. And in terms of the time varying demand factors, we control these factors by the foot traffic and weather. So we use we found like interesting variable, which is we call like foot traffic, which is defined as the number of like cell phone users within 1.5 kilometer of its theater, so that it can capture the like foot flow, right? So many like previous studies use like a resident population as a market size. They can affect their market characteristic. But this like foot traffic measure is quite attractive because it can affect the time varying demand factors. So we have like three different levels of this foot traffic, which is of course time of the day and month of the year and day of the week. And we also include temperature and rainfall measure at a weather station nearest to each theater to control for time varying demand factors. And in terms of the movie characteristics that can affect the revenue and also the SIP pricing. So we control like a non-time varying movie quality using like movie fixed effects, and additionally include like opening week dummy, which can affect the time effect of the movie characteristics and number of days since the movie's release based on the like previous literature. Okay, so let me briefly talk about identification, how we can identify the revenue impact of the SIP pricing. So the basic idea and the sketch of the identification is that conditional and observable variables affecting show revenue, the difference in log of the revenue between shows using SIP pricing and not using SIP pricing. So by like identifying the difference between show using SIP pricing and not using SIP pricing, we identify the impact of the price discrimination. So there are like different sources of the identification. The first source of the identification is the comparison between CGV theaters with SIP pricing and non-CGV theaters without SIP pricing. So as I mentioned, there are like 114 CGV theaters use SIP pricing, but the other multiplex chain, Lotte Cinema and Megabox, they don't use SIP pricing. So by comparing these like two sets of theater, we can identify the revenue impact of the SIP pricing. And then the second source of identification of SIP pricing is the comparison between CGV theaters with SIP pricing and CGV theaters without SIP pricing. So as I mentioned earlier, there are like 114 CGV theaters use SIP pricing, but at the same time, there are like 30 CGV theaters that didn't adopt the SIP pricing. So by making comparison between these two different like type of CGV theater, we can identify, it can help identify revenue impact of the SIP pricing. And the last source of identification is within the CGV theaters. So I also like mentioned this earlier, the early morning shows are not subject to SIP pricing, but at the same time, non-early morning shows are subject to SIP pricing. So by comparing these two different type of show, early morning shows and non-early morning shows, it can help identify revenue impact of the SIP pricing. So let me talk about the estimation result, which can answer the first research question, which is about effect of the SIP pricing on revenue and number of audiences. So the effect of the SIP pricing on revenue is identified in the red block, so which is the coefficient of the SIP pricing. So which shows that the SIP pricing increased the revenue per show by about 7% on average. And in terms of the impact of the seat pricing on number of audiences or number of ticket source, which is captured in the column 5, this column. So we essentially run the same regression, but we use the different dependent variable, which is number of ticket source, and we also include log of price because this is quantity equation. And the interesting thing is that the demand for movie shows is inelastic, so which is identified as negative 0.36. So which means that the theaters can increase their revenue by increasing the price because demand for movie shows is inelastic. So this inelastic result is consistent with previous literature on movie theater. Yes, and also the coefficient on seat pricing. So the dependent variable is a number of tickets sold, which suggests that the seat pricing, so it's very small. And it's not significant, which suggests that the seat pricing doesn't affect the show attendance. So to sum up the result from the regression, which suggests that the seat pricing increases the revenue, but doesn't affect the number of tickets sold. So as we see, it increases the revenue, but it doesn't affect the number of tickets sold. So what this result implies is that the proportion of audiences who sit in the prime zone is larger than that of audiences who sit in the economy zone. So why this is the case? To see why this is the case, so let's consider show 1 and show 2. So show 1 is using seat pricing, but show 2 using uniform pricing. And let's say P1G is the price for show 1's ticket price. And Q1G is the number of tickets sold for different seat quality, prime and standard and economy. And P2 is similarly show 2's ticket price, which use uniform pricing, and Q2 is number of tickets sold. So the difference between the price difference between the prime zone and standard zone is the same. So I explained, which is an empirical case in our study. So the difference between prime price of the prime zone and the standard zone is 1,000 Korean won, which is $1 US. And also the price of the standard zone and economy zone, difference between these two is also 1,000 Korean won, the same. And let's lambda G is the proportion of audiences seated in each zone, so that the sum of this proportion sums up to 1. Okay, then the revenue for show 1 is essentially proportional to difference between proportion of audiences seated in prime zone and economy zone. So by a simple manipulation, this is the result. And the R2 is just P2 times Q2. And since price of the standard zone is similar to the price of the shows that use uniform pricing, which is the empirical case, which is the case in our data set, and also Q1, number of ticket sold for shows using seat pricing, and Q2 that use uniform pricing is the same. That is because we found from the regression result, the seat pricing doesn't affect the number of tickets sold. So that we have the revenue difference between shows using seat pricing and shows not using seat pricing is essentially, I'm sorry, proportional to the difference between proportion of audiences seated in prime zone and economy zone. So what this suggests is that for revenue increasement for using seat pricing, it must be that a proportion of audiences seated in prime zone is greater than a proportion of audiences seated in economy zone. So then why the proportion of audiences seated in prime zone is greater than proportion of audiences seated in economy zone? This can arise when price for the prime zone is not high enough to induce moviegoers with lower willingness to pay for seat quality to buy the economy zone tickets. So again, price for the prime zone is not high enough to induce moviegoers with lower willingness to pay for seat quality to buy the economy zone tickets. So the one explanation for such like pricing scheme is that if like price for the prime zone is high, some of them wouldn't be sold. Some of like prime zone seats wouldn't be sold, which means that after a show starts, some audiences in economy zone seats would move to occupy unsold like prime zone seats. So which is quite like probable. But the theater may probably enforce like seat rights by like checking the tickets before like show start, but it's quite like costly to enforce this kind of activity. Maybe like from the perspective of theater, a cheaper way to enforce like a seat rights is to ensure that the prime zone seats are fully sold, so that audiences holding economy zone tickets are prevented from moving to prime zone seats. How this can be achieved? This can be achieved by like reducing the price of the prime zone seats. So in a situation like in our empirical context, that a large number of prime zone seats remain unsold, CGV, which implement the seat pricing, they encourage the prime zone seats to sell first by not setting their prime zone seats too high to implement this kind of pricing scheme. Okay, so to verify whether there is a like tendency for prime zone to be sold first, so I claim that the CGV's like seat pricing involves encouraging like prime zone seats to sell first. So whether this is really the case, I plot the dispersion of ratio of occupied each different seats to occupied seat, which is on the y-axis. So for example, for prime zone, y-axis is the ratio of the occupied prime seats to occupied seats. And on y-axis, which is the utilization rate, occupied seats divided by total seats. So to give you an example, what this plot represent, when like a capacity utilization is less than 10%, so the capacity utilization is less than 10%, then the ratio of occupied prime seats to occupied seat is 0.8%. And these lines represent the like a quantile. The bottom line represent the first quantile, and then this middle line represent the median, and this top line represent the third quantile. So which is about like 0.8% for this median, which means that for half of the show, this is median, half of the shows with less than 10% of the utilization rate, more than 80% of the audiences are seated in a prime zone, which means that the consumer has like a strong preference to the prime zone compared to other seating zones. So for the sake of the time being, let me just summarize what these plots represent. So the first like pattern, where is this? Okay. So the first pattern, so sorry about this. So this is my first time using the Microsoft Teams, so it's quite clumsy. So the first pattern is that when the capacity utilization is low, the median ratio of the occupied prime seats to occupied seat is high. What this implies is that even if a large number of seats are available, most moviegoers choose seats in the prime zone that are priced higher. So they have like strong preference and reservation for choosing the like prime zone seat. And the second pattern is that the median ratio for the standard and economy zone increase with the capacity utilization. What this implies that the binding capacity constraint of the prime zone cause moviegoers to buy tickets for the two zones. What these two findings imply is that the seats in the prime zones are sold earlier than those in the other two zones, which confirms our conjecture in the previous slide. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, the revenue impact of the second-degree price discrimination is affected by the proportion of audiences seated in prime zone and the proportion of audiences seated in economy zone. And also, a number of moviegoers that buy the prime zone tickets may be influenced by the number of unoccupied prime seats. So as I explained earlier, which means that the return to seat pricing may vary with capacity utilization. So to see whether like return to seat pricing can vary with capacity utilization, we did additional analysis which represent the how like return to seat pricing can vary with the capacity utilization. So which shows that seat pricing has a large effect on show revenue when the capacity utilization is between 20 and 40%, which is almost about 18% of the return to seat pricing. So why this result can happen? The number of audiences in this range almost reach the seating capacity of the prime zone. So when the capacity utilization is between like 20 and 40%, so it hits the capacity of the prime zone. And the prime zone, as I explained earlier, tend to sold out first. So that like it makes the difference between the proportion of audiences seated in prime zone and the economy zone on the largest. So that like the revenue impact of the seat pricing would be higher. So this is like equation. So the difference between revenue of like seat pricing and then not using seat pricing is proportional to this proportion. Okay. So so let me answer the second research question. So the second research question is about how the return to seat pricing is affected by the competition. So before I answer this question, let me just answer the general effect of the competition on revenue. So the effect of the competition on revenue is that competition, as we expect, competition negatively affects the revenue. So which is identified here. So if the number of shows played by other theaters and also within like a certain time window. So for example, if a show increased by 1 unit by the other theaters within 2 kilometers and 1 hour time interval, then revenue would decrease by 2.9%. So, and as we expect, like the competition effect becomes weaker as we define the market more broadly in terms of radial distance, so 2 kilometer and 4 kilometer, and short time interval. So we see the effect of competition is weaker as we define like broader market definition. Okay. And
sorry for interrupting. There's only 5 minutes left for presentation. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Yes, let me like answer the question, like the second research question. So the effect of the competition, how the effect of the competition can, how the like return to seat pricing can vary with the competition. So which is identified in the coefficient on seat price interaction between seat pricing and competition, which shows that this coefficient is a negative, but quantitatively small. What it means is that the competition slightly reduce the average increase in revenue associated with using seat pricing. This finding may be explained by the switching cost between shows. So as I explained earlier, according to like a survey to the moviegoers in South Korean movie theater, theater locations and show times are the most important factors that moviegoers consider when they are planning to watch a particular movie, which means that switching from one show to another incur like significant like switching costs because of like being away from preferred theater location and show time. And in general, like moviegoers with higher willingness to pay for seat quality are likely to have high switching costs. So in the case, despite a decline in total audience by the competition, the proportion of audiences seated in prime zone, the difference between proportion of audience seated in prime zone and the proportion of audiences seated in economy zone doesn't change much, right? Because of these moviegoers with higher willingness to pay with higher switching costs, which result in the limited competition effect on the return to seat pricing. Okay, so in general, the average return to seat pricing is in a range of 10.2% to 10.9% across the alternative competition measure when you are counting this competition. Okay. So let me summarize our research. So the one contribution of this research is that we examine the empirical relationship between return to seat pricing and competition. And the main findings from our research are threefold. The first main finding is that seat pricing is about 10% greater revenue than uniform pricing, but doesn't affect the number of tickets sold. And the second finding is that the seat pricing has the largest effect on show revenue when the capacity utilization is between 20% and 40%. This is because consumers prefer prime zone seats. And the last finding is that the return to seat pricing is hardly affected by the degree of the competition. Okay, so those are the all findings that we found in our research. Thank you for listening and thank you for paying your attention. Thank you. Okay. Stop. Yes. Thank you.
Min, can you see my screen?
Yes, I can see. Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, thank you. First of all, thank you, Min, for the fantastic presentation. Thank you to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to discuss the paper. I think it's a really nice paper, nice setting to study second-degree price discrimination. And in terms of my discussion over here today, I will first summarize the paper briefly, then I will offer some suggestions on the current analysis, provide some guidance on the analysis moving forward. So first, a summary of the paper. Min did a really good job in talking about the different aspects of the paper, so I'll not spend too much time. But broadly, the data over here is from 3 large multiplex chains in Korea, which together account for about 97% of the market. CGV, which is the leading chain, switched to seat pricing, which is prime, standard, and economy in March 2016. The difference between these 3 zones is approximately $1, and uniform pricing is still maintained for 3D movies or for premium auditorium, for example. The data for the current study is from August to December 2017. They have about 99.7% theaters of these 3 chains, which collectively, as I said, account for 97% market share. So broadly speaking, they pretty much have data on the entire market. And the data over here is scraped every few minutes from the booking website, right? My understanding is that this also gives them sort of a repeated cross-section or panel nature to the data, and I'll talk about this later. The analysis then is based on 118 movies which are screened at least 1,000 times. The empirical analysis is based on a regression where log revenue is regressed on different characteristics. Revenue over here is only based on box office collections, as Min mentioned, does not account for the concession sales. In terms of the key variables of interest, the SPI is an indicator variable for whether the theater has seat pricing or not, and not theater, but I would say the show, which as Min defined is a combination of movie at a theater in a certain auditorium on a given day at a given time. The XI variables over here are the show specific characteristics such as seating capacity, auditorium type, and so on. YI are the competition and capacity utilization measures which are important for this current study. And competition is based on the number of movies of the same title or the number of shows of the same title which are played within a certain radius and within a certain number of hours. The analysis also controls for foot traffic, weather, and then there are a lot of fixed effects to control for differences across movies, across theater, the day of the week, time of the day, and so on. So if I look at the specification broadly, it is very similar to Corti and Pagliaro, who study the effect of seat pricing, but in the concert industry or among concerts. And I'll talk about the differences and similarities about these. In terms of findings then, the key findings are that seat pricing increases revenue by about 10.6%. This is broadly in line with the 5% increase reported in the concert industry. Leslie 2004, Corti and Pagliaro, and Eckard and Smith, all of them have findings which are in the 4 to 5% region. The authors, Min and his authors, find that competition has a small negative impact on revenue. And finally, the impact of seat pricing on revenue is highest for a capacity utilization between 20 and 40%. So broadly thinking, the strength of the paper, I would say three things over here. First, the rich and comprehensive data, which encompasses pretty much the entire market of movie theaters in Korea, where the authors observe prices and demand for each show, and also, I presume, over time. I think the topic of this paper is important, quantifying and understanding the gains from second-degree price discrimination, especially in the movie theater market, which has received a lot of interest, not only in marketing, but also economics. And finally, the results that Min presented are broadly consistent with the previous literature. They're interesting and consistent. So to understand the contribution of this paper, and this is where I think I'll offer some suggestions on current analysis and analysis moving forward, I think it's important to position the paper with regard to the previous literature. So role of price discrimination, third-degree price discrimination predominantly, and competition have been studied in the movie industry. And Min mentioned a lot of these papers. I mentioned Ricard and Wes's paper over here, where they look at the price discrimination incentive between movie prices and concession sales. But the DeRoos and McKinsey look at Tuesday pricing or discounted pricing on a particular day. And then Yeshim's paper, they're looking at the decision of which movies to showcase, for example. If we go away from the movie industry, in the industry for concerts, second-degree price discrimination has been extensively studied empirically, and second-degree price discrimination in this case is with seat pricing. So again, papers which I mentioned earlier. So this begs the question of what is different about the movie theater industry. And as Min mentioned, competition is one key differentiating factor, where in concerts, if a concert is organized in a particular city, then there might be other concerts, but they're weak substitutes in that the same concert or the same artist is not playing in two different locations in a city within a very close time window. By contrast, in movies, the same movie title could be playing at multiple theaters which are close to each other and around the same time. So these are much stronger substitutes. The second source of difference is the choice that consumers have, where if there is a concert playing, it is at a venue which may or may not have seat pricing. Consumers do not have the option to opt out or opt into seat pricing. Whereas in the case of movies, consumers are actively choosing which theater to go to, or even within a chain, which auditorium to watch the movie in, so they can opt in and opt out of seat pricing. What does this mean then? In terms of identification broadly and thinking about competition, theaters are choosing which movie to show at what time and in which format. Even CGV has theaters which are seat pricing, 114 theaters, 30 of them which do not have seat pricing, which could be premium or which could be 3D or uniform pricing otherwise. So theaters are systematically deciding, CGV is deciding which movie to play at which time, in which format, with or without seat pricing. At the same time, competitors are making similar decisions for any given movie. What this means is that number of shows of a particular movie, which are at competing theaters within a time window, are endogenously determined. right? And I know the paper includes a lot of fixed effects to capture average across movie differences, theater differences, day of the week, and time of the day. But I do not believe this completely captures the endogenous nature of competition that is prevalent in the movie theater industry. Further, the capacity utilization that Min focused on is an outcome of the assortment that is provided to consumers, right? They have a choice between different movies, different theaters, different formats, and they're choosing options. And what we observe as the outcome is capacity utilization. So it's very likely that the capacity utilization is correlated with unobserved demand shocks, which also determine revenue, which could result in the familiar endogeneity concerns. So how should we think about measuring the effect of seat pricing in the movie theater industry? Fundamentally, I mean, we could do a thought experiment where we could observe the revenue at a theater before and after seat pricing is introduced. Movies could be randomly allocated to whether there's seat pricing or not, randomly allocated to time of the day or day of the week. And then we could compare revenues across for the same movie across different theaters with and without seat pricing. Having said that, we acknowledge that you know, such an experiment is difficult to conduct in the movie industry. So we need to find some sort of a valid control group to benchmark the effect of seat pricing. And the control group that Min discussed of having different theaters or same movie at different times, or morning versus non-morning, unfortunately, a lot of them suffer from the same issue, same concern about the endogeneity or selection of which movies are playing at which time, at which theater, in which format. And competitors simultaneously choosing what movies they should screen. So some thoughts that I can offer, and these are very rough, but broadly thinking about what the control group could be. One option could be to look at a revenue of movies in the pre-seat pricing period. So let's say 2 years ago, but that again requires data from before and after across different movies. Another option could be to look at the same movie and try and understand the differences of a movie playing at a theater with seat pricing, another theater without seat pricing of, let's say, CGV, and then comparing the revenue of the same movie at a non-CGV theater where it is playing in the same format but without seat pricing. So kind of like trying to get at a 2x2 design. Another thought process could be to utilize the exogenous variation in theater sizes. And what I have in mind over here is that theaters which have seat pricing may differ in their sizes. So a seat or two seats in different theaters which are equidistant from the screen, so their relative positioning or the quality of the seat is the same, but because of difference in theater sizes, one is allocated as a standard seat, the other one a premium seat, or one is allocated as a standard, the other one an economy, which provides some exogenous variation to think about seat pricing. And finally, there is work like Paul Ellickson and Paul Greco have this paper where they study the effect of competition using concentric rings. And the idea over here is that movies, in this case, we could say movies or theaters which are furthest away in the farthest concentric ring are least impacted by competition. And as we get closer, the degree of impact increases. So we could almost do a diff and diff sort of analysis. So this is just some thoughts on how we could think about a control group. Now, some suggestions on further analysis which can be done or how the paper could be strengthened. One, of course, is testing theory on second-degree price discrimination. So Stoll has analytical work or theory which establishes a relationship between price dispersion, quality distortion, and competition. And Rosen and Rosenfeld then also have research which links the differences in willingness to pay for seats and how that evolves with income and income inequality across different regions, something which Coty and Pagliaro test in their case as well. Finally, if data allows the authors and they can collect data on concession sales, I think it would be very interesting to study how seat pricing impacts concession sales. And the reason why I mentioned this is Ricard and Wes in their paper show that concession sales account for about 1/3 of the revenue that movie theaters collect. And given the contracts that movie theaters have with distributors, it is very likely that concession sales account for more profit or substantially more profit than just 1/3. So theaters care about concession sales. So when we think about the profitability of seat pricing, it might be helpful to account for the profit or revenue coming from concession. And this would then get into the single crossing property testing, the single crossing property from OE 1971, which Ricardo and West do in their 2009 paper. Another direction in which I believe that the paper can be pushed further is utilizing the within show temporal variation in data. So it is my understanding that when the authors scrape data from the website every few minutes or several minutes, then what they're getting is essentially a snapshot of the seats booked at a theater at different points in time. So they have within a show variation in bookings, which is temporal variation in bookings. What this allows the authors to do then is understand what the distribution of willingness to pay looks like. So essentially what I have in mind is this, right? If we look at the total utilization or the total seats that are booked for a particular show, we could look at the proportion of seats booked at, let's say, premium versus standard zones. And then we also have additional information in the order in which these seats are filled. So if all premium seats are filled first and then standard seats are filled, versus both types of seats are simultaneously getting filled, it tells us a lot about the distribution of willingness to pay. Leslie in his paper simulates consumers and allows them to come in sequence and explicitly accounts for this endogenous variation in the choice set. But over there, at the end of the day, the data is matched or the choice shares are matched to the aggregate sales of or market or shares of different seat types. But if the authors have data for within each showing, then they could actually study in more detail how willingness to pay varies across different types of seats in this case. So what I have in mind is probably a structural demand model. It doesn't have to be a structural model, but that is one approach where a model could explicitly account for competition and the variation in choice sets, both across consumers within a theater, so that is the endogenous variation, versus across different theaters for different movies. In a model like that, capacity constraints could provide exogenous variation in the number of seats which are available within each type of seat pricing or within each type. And capacity utilization then would be an outcome of the choice model. So that would allow the authors to better study this question of how the gains from seat pricing vary, or I would say how they determine the capacity which is utilized. Right, so these are just some thoughts, I think, in terms of how the analysis in the current paper can be strengthened and some directions in which the analysis can be pushed. That's all I have. Thank you very much. I thank the authors once again for the opportunity to discuss the paper and thank UTD conference members as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Pranav. These are all good suggestions. I will think hard about that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Hello. Let's see. Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me over there?
Yes.
I just want to remind everybody our keynote speaker will be in room 1. He may be there now or about to start at 1 o'clock. So you can leave this and go to room 1 to visit, to listen to our keynote speaker, okay?
Okay.